It began in darkness, a night so cold that even the snow seemed to whisper. It was December 16th, 1944, and deep above the frozen forests of the Ardennes, hundreds of German transport planes clawed through the winter sky. Inside them sat paratroopers, shivering, silent, and uncertain, men of the Fallschirmjäger, Germany's once proud airborne arm. They were not the elite warriors of Crete or Eben Emmel anymore. These were remnants, hastily gathered veterans and raw recruits, thrown together for one last desperate mission. Their orders were daring, perhaps impossible: drop behind enemy lines in the dead of night, seize key crossroads, and hold them until reinforcements arrived. It was called Operation Stösser, a name that would soon become synonymous with confusion, disaster, and the collapse of a dream. This is the entire history of Operation Stösser, the failed paratrooper drop of the Battle of the Bulge, a story of courage lost to chaos and of one man's attempt to turn the tide of a dying war through the skies. By December 1944, the Third Reich was cornered but not yet broken. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was preparing its final push toward Berlin. In the West, Allied forces had crossed France and stood poised on Germany's borders, yet Hitler still believed he could snatch victory from the jaws of ruin. His plan, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, was audacious beyond reason. He would strike through the snow-covered forests of Belgium, split the Allied armies in two, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It was a fantasy, but one powered by desperation. For it to succeed, his armored spearheads needed surprise, speed, and above all, confusion behind the Allied lines. That confusion would be sown by one of Germany's most unconventional officers, Colonel Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte. A veteran of airborne warfare, since the early days of the war, von der Heydte had commanded paratroopers in Crete, North Africa, and Italy. By the winter of '44, his once proud corps was a shadow of itself, understrength, undersupplied, and scattered across Germany. But when the order came from Field Marshal Model and Luftwaffe General Kurt Student to organize an airborne operation to support the Ardennes attack, he did not refuse. His mission, to drop 1,000 paratroopers north of Malmedy, near the crossroads of Baraque Michel, and seize the high ground to block Allied reinforcements. He was told it would be simple: a quick strike, a few hours of resistance, then relief by advancing panzer units. The reality would be far different. The plan was doomed from the start. Germany no longer possessed the airborne strength it once had. There were not enough planes, not enough trained paratroopers, and not enough fuel to sustain the operation. Most of von der Heydte's men were inexperienced, Luftwaffe ground personnel, clerks and engineers pressed into service as makeshift paratroopers. Their equipment was incomplete, their training rushed. Even their aircraft, Junkers Ju-52s, were old and vulnerable, flying without escort through skies now ruled by the Allies. And yet, on the freezing night of December 16th, the mission went ahead. Shortly after 3 a.m., the first planes lifted off from German airfields. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. Strong winds battered the formations, scattering them across the darkened sky. Allied anti-aircraft fire erupted from below as they crossed the front lines, further breaking apart their formations. Paratroopers jumped into chaos, flung into the night by pilots who couldn't find their targets. Some landed miles from their drop zones. Others never made it out of their aircraft. Parachutes caught on trees. Men hit frozen ground and broke bones. Weapons and radios were lost in the drifts. The drop that was meant to land 1,000 men behind Allied lines instead scattered fewer than 300 across a 50-mile radius. Those who survived the jump found themselves alone, isolated in enemy territory, surrounded by snow, silence, and uncertainty. Von der Heydte himself, injured during the landing, gathered what men he could, barely 100, and began to move toward the objective. But there was no objective anymore. The designated crossroads were already crawling with American patrols. The roads were impassable. The promised reinforcements never came. For 2 days, von der Heydte's small band of paratroopers wandered through the forest, ambushing convoys, cutting communication lines, and doing what damage they could before being overwhelmed. They were ghosts in the woods, confused, hungry, and hunted. As word spread of German paratroopers behind the lines, panic rippled through the Allied rear. Reports of enemy drops flooded headquarters in towns like Eupen, Spa, and Malmedy. Rumors swirled that entire airborne divisions had landed. Roadblocks went up overnight. Military police interrogated every driver, every messenger, every soldier. It was a chaos that mirrored the panic caused by Operation Grief, Skorzny's mission of infiltrators in American uniforms. Though the actual number of paratroopers was small, the fear they inspired was vast. In this sense, Operation Stösser succeeded, but only as a ghost story. By December 18th, the mission was over. The few remaining paratroopers, exhausted and frozen, scattered into the countryside. Some tried to make their way back to German lines. Others were captured by American patrols. Von der Heydte himself, his leg broken and his strength gone, wandered for days before finally surrendering to an American outpost near Monschau. When questioned, he reportedly said, "The operation was doomed before it began." He was right. Operation Stösser had been a microcosm of the Third Reich's final months, ambitious, reckless, and futile. It accomplished little militarily, but it revealed much about the state of Hitler's war machine. The once unstoppable Fallschirmjäger, the airborne knights of the early Blitzkrieg, were now reduced to fragments. Brave men thrown into impossible missions by leaders who no longer grasped reality. And yet, even in failure, there was tragedy and courage. Many of the paratroopers fought on, despite hopeless odds, their discipline and loyalty unbroken. They died in the snow, far from home, their mission already forgotten in the roar of tank engines and artillery that filled the Ardennes. The failure of Operation Stösser did not change the course of the Battle of the Bulge, but it symbolized the delusion that had come to define Germany's final stand. It was a plan conceived in arrogance, executed in desperation, and remembered for its futility. Today, the forests around Malmedy are quiet again. The wind moves through the trees that once caught parachutes. The snow falls gently over the hills where men fought and froze. The ghosts of those who jumped into that endless night still linger, not as heroes or villains, but as echoes of a war that refused to die quietly. Operation Stösser was meant to be a blow of surprise and brilliance, a dagger from the sky. Instead, it was a descent into confusion, a final flicker of a once great force fading into darkness. Tonight, we return to that frozen sky, to the roar of engines above the Ardennes, to the scattered drops that vanished into the storm, and to the silence that followed when the snow buried their footprints forever. This is the entire history of Operation Stösser, the failed paratrooper drop of the Battle of the Bulge, a mission of courage lost to chaos, and the night when even the sky betrayed them. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere warm and quiet, far from the snow and the wind of that doomed descent, or can you almost feel the cold air rushing past as they fell through the darkness? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. December 17th, 1944. 6 o'clock in the morning. American soldiers hunched in frozen foxholes near Malmedy, Belgium, heard the rumble before they saw anything. Aircraft engines overhead, dozens of them, maybe more. The sound grew louder, closer, then passed directly above their positions in complete darkness. They waited for parachutes to blossom against the pre-dawn sky, for the distinctive crack of airborne troops hitting winter ground, for the chaos that always followed a drop. But nothing came. The engines faded into the distance, swallowed by wind and forest. The sky remained empty. The soldiers exchanged confused glances, wondering if exhaustion had conjured phantom aircraft, if the grinding stress of holding the line had finally broken something in their minds. 2 days later, a patrol from the 99th Infantry Division found him in the woods near Eupen, a single German paratrooper, frozen solid, his body locked in a half-sitting position against a tree trunk. His parachute hung 30 feet above him, snagged in branches, snow gathering in its folds. He wore the distinctive jump smock of the Fallschirmjäger, the elite German airborne troops who had terrorized Europe in the war's early years. But he carried no identification, no papers, no clue about what unit he belonged to or why he had dropped here, miles from any logical military objective. The patrol cut him down, logged him as an unknown enemy casualty, and moved on. They had bigger problems. The entire American line was collapsing under a massive German offensive that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. One frozen paratrooper was a footnote, a curiosity, nothing more. In the months that followed, as Allied forces pushed back the German onslaught and began the final drive toward Berlin, military intelligence officers started piecing together something strange. They had captured over 150 German paratroopers during the opening days of the offensive, all in the same general area of the Ardennes forest. Each prisoner told similar stories. They had jumped from aircraft, become separated from their units, wandered for days trying to find friendly lines. But when interrogators tried to understand the scope of the operation, the accounts fractured into contradictions. Some prisoners spoke of hundreds of paratroopers in the air. Others claimed to have seen over 1,000. Drop zones varied wildly in the testimonies. Mission objectives ranged from sabotage to reconnaissance to blocking American reinforcements. The interrogators classified them as Special Forces infiltrators, small teams inserted for harassment purposes, and filed away the reports. The German records told an even stranger story. In 1946, Allied investigators sifting through captured Wehrmacht archives found planning documents for something called Operation Stösser, a massive airborne assault launched on December 16, 1944. The paperwork described a full regiment, approximately 1,200 elite paratroopers, dropped behind American lines to seize a critical crossroads called Baraque Michel. The operation was part of Hitler's last great gamble in the West, the surprise offensive through the Ardennes designed to split Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. But here was the mystery. American intelligence had no record of any such airborne operation. No major parachute drop had been detected. No massed formation of German paratroopers had ever materialized at any crossroads. 1,200 men had apparently vanished into the winter darkness, and neither side seemed to know what had happened to them. The commander of Operation Stösser was Oberst Friedrich August von der Heydte, one of Germany's most decorated soldiers, born into Bavarian nobility, educated in international law, holder of the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. Von der Heydte had led paratroopers through every major campaign from Crete in 1941 to Normandy in 1944. He was a professional soldier in an increasingly amateur army, a Catholic aristocrat navigating Hitler's brutal regime, a man whose military reputation was unquestioned even by his enemies. In the summer of 1946, American intelligence officers located him in a prisoner of war camp and began what would become weeks of interrogation. What they heard left them stunned. Von der Heydte described an operation so catastrophically mismanaged, so thoroughly doomed from conception, that the interrogators initially suspected he was exaggerating to absolve himself of responsibility. He told them about receiving his orders with just 8 days' notice for an operation that required at least 6 weeks of preparation. He described an improvised unit cobbled together from flight training schools and hospital wards, most of whom had never made a combat jump, some of whom had never jumped at all. He explained how he had documented 14 separate fatal flaws in the operational plan and submitted them in writing to his superiors, only to be told the attack would proceed regardless. He recounted the chaos of the night drop, pilots who lost their way, aircraft scattered by American anti-aircraft fire, paratroopers deposited across a 25-kilometer radius instead of a concentrated drop zone. And then came the most remarkable part of his testimony. After struggling for 3 days to assemble even a quarter of his force, after realizing the mission was impossible and rescue unlikely, von der Heydte had dissolved his command. He released his men to find their own way back to German lines. then surrendered himself personally to American forces. The American interrogators checked his story against captured German records and prisoner testimony. Everything matched. Operation Stösser had indeed been launched with 1,200 paratroopers. The vast majority had been scattered so completely that they never found each other, never assembled into a fighting force, never reached their objective. Some made it back to German lines after days or weeks of evasion. Many were captured. Dozens died of exposure in the frozen Ardennes, and roughly 400 simply disappeared from all official records, their fates unknown, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. It was the largest dispersal of paratroopers in military history, an elite regiment that had effectively ceased to exist within hours of deployment. But here was the truly haunting part. The operation had failed so completely, so thoroughly, that it had become invisible. German High Command never fully understood what went wrong because communications collapsed before the disaster became apparent. American intelligence never detected the operation because the scattered paratroopers never formed into a recognizable threat. The soldiers who heard aircraft overhead that December morning had not imagined them, but they might as well have because nothing came of it. A ghost drop. 1,200 men launched into darkness and dispersed like smoke, leaving barely a trace in the historical record. For decades after the war, military historians debated whether Operation Stösser had even happened as described, or if the scattered prisoners and frozen bodies represented something else entirely, some smaller operation that grew in the retelling. The physical evidence was maddeningly sparse. 3 different German planning maps showed 3 different drop zones, suggesting confusion at the highest levels about where the paratroopers were even supposed to land. Luftwaffe flight logs recorded 112 Junkers 52 transport aircraft taking off from bases in western Germany, but many pilots' after-action reports were lost or never written, consumed in the chaos of Germany's collapsing war effort. American unit histories from the Battle of the Bulge occasionally mentioned capturing German paratroopers, but treated them as curiosities rather than components of a major operation. The crossroads at Baraque, Michel, the supposed objective, was indeed a strategically important position during the offensive, but no German forces ever came close to seizing it, and no concentrated force of paratroopers was ever detected in the area. In the decades since, researchers have slowly reconstructed what happened that December night through fragments, prisoner testimonies, scattered personnel records, pension claims filed by survivors, archaeological surveys of the drop zones. They have found equipment scattered across the Ardennes, from Monschau in the south to Spa in the north. Physical proof of the impossible dispersal. They have identified crash sites of Junkers transports shot down by American anti-aircraft guns, evidence of the aviation chaos. They have interviewed surviving participants, hearing stories of men wandering lost through enemy territory, hiding in barns, stealing food from American supply depots, fighting private wars of survival while the Battle of the Bulge raged around them. And slowly the ghost drop has materialized into history, becoming real again through the accumulation of these fragments. What emerges is a story that transcends simple military failure. Operation Stösser represents something more fundamental: the collision between institutional fantasy and operational reality, between what commanders wanted to believe was possible and what was actually achievable. It shows what happens when military organizations become so desperate, so detached from the constraints of logistics and training and human capability, that they launch operations they themselves know cannot succeed. Von der Heydte had documented the flaws. His superiors had received the warnings. Everyone involved understood on some level that the mission was suicidal. Yet the machinery of command ground forward anyway, feeding 1,200 men into the winter darkness because stopping would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about Germany's position in the war. The frozen paratrooper found near Eupen was eventually identified through dental records in the 1950s. His name was Gefreiter Anton Schreiber, age 19, conscripted in October 1944, given 3 weeks of basic parachute training at a facility in Austria, and assigned to Kampfgruppe von der Heydte in early December. He had made exactly one practice jump before Operation Stösser. When his chute caught in the trees during the combat drop, he likely survived the landing, but lacked the experience or equipment to free himself quickly. With temperatures dropping to -18 Celsius that night, hypothermia would have set in within hours. He died alone, suspended in a tree, within 2 kilometers of an American field hospital he probably never knew existed. His body hung there for 2 days before the patrol found him. He is buried now in a German military cemetery in Belgium, one of 157 confirmed Stösser casualties, though the true number will never be known. This is the story of those 1,200 men, their impossible mission, and the commanders who sent them to die, knowing they would fail. It is a story that Germany wanted to forget, that the victorious Allies never quite noticed, that slipped through the cracks of history for decades. But it is also a story that keeps resurfacing, demanding to be remembered, because it reveals something essential about war, command, and the price of institutional delusion. Operation Stösser was not an aberration. It was not unique. It was simply the most spectacular example of a pattern that repeats across military history. Soldiers paying for their leaders' fantasies with their lives. The aircraft sounds that American troops heard on the morning of December 17th were real. The operation happened. 1,200 paratroopers jumped into darkness over the Ardennes forest. Most of them simply landed so far from each other, so scattered across the frozen landscape, that they never became an army. They became individuals again, each fighting a private war of survival, each making their own choice about whether to continue toward an impossible objective or simply try to stay alive. Some made it home. Many did not. All of them disappeared, at least temporarily, into the gap between what was planned and what was possible. They became ghosts. And like all ghosts, they haunt the places where they died, asking questions that the living still struggle to answer. What they ask is simple. Why? Why were we sent? Why did no one stop this? Why does it keep happening? The answers begin 8 days before the drop, in a headquarters meeting in the Netherlands, where Friedrich von der Heydte was about to receive the worst orders of his career. He would later say that the moment he heard the plan, he knew most of his men were doomed, but he also knew that in Hitler's Germany in December 1944, there was no way to refuse. The machinery had started. The ghost drop was coming. All he could do was document his objections, lead his men with as much skill as circumstances allowed, and hope that history would remember that he had tried to stop it. It did not stop. On the night of December 16th, 112 aircraft took off into winter darkness, carrying 1,200 men toward a mission that would kill or capture or scatter nearly all of them within 48 hours. This is how the ghost drop happened. This is why it disappeared. And this is why, 80 years later, we are still trying to understand what it means. December 8th, 1944. Heydte, Netherlands. Oberst Friedrich August von der Heydte stood in the afternoon cold outside a requisitioned farmhouse, smoking a cigarette and wondering why General Oberst Kurt Student had summoned him with such urgency. Student was a legend, the father of German airborne forces, the architect of the stunning parachute assaults on Belgium and Crete that had terrified the world in 1940 and 1941. Von der Heydte respected him enormously, had served under him throughout those campaigns, had learned airborne warfare at his feet. But it was December 1944 now, not May 1940. The world had changed. Germany's paratroopers no longer dropped from the sky in massed formations. They fought as ground infantry, bleeding out in France and Italy and the Eastern Front, their transport aircraft long since destroyed or converted to other purposes. The age of German airborne operations had ended at Crete, where nearly 7,000 paratroopers had been killed or wounded, capturing a single island. Hitler had declared after Crete that the day of the paratrooper was over. So why this meeting? Why the secrecy? Why the barely concealed tension in the staff officer who had delivered the summons? Student greeted him warmly, but von der Heydte noticed immediately that the older man looked exhausted, diminished somehow, as if he had aged a decade in the months since they had last met. They spoke briefly about old campaigns, mutual friends killed or captured in Normandy, the grim state of the war. Then student's tone shifted. He explained that the Führer was planning a massive counteroffensive in the west, a surprise blow through the Ardennes that would split the American and British armies, recapture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was an audacious plan, student said, perhaps Germany's last chance to avoid total defeat, and it required an airborne component. A regiment of paratroopers would drop behind American lines to seize a critical crossroads and block enemy reinforcements during the offensive's crucial opening phase. Student paused, studying von der Heydte's face. The crossroads was called Baraque Michel, in the High Fens region of Belgium. The drop would happen in 8 days. Von der Heydte would command it. The cigarette burned forgotten between von der Heydte's fingers. 8 days. He managed to keep his voice level as he asked the obvious questions. What forces would he command? Where would they come from? What was the training status of the men? Students' answers grew vaguer with each question. The unit would be assembled from various sources. Training schools mostly. Replacement depots. Perhaps some men returning from hospital. The exact numbers were still being determined, but roughly 1,200 paratroopers. Von der Heydte felt something cold settle in his stomach. 1,200 men from training schools and hospitals assembled in 8 days for a combat jump behind enemy lines in winter. It was insane. He said so, as diplomatically as he could manage. Students' face hardened. The orders came directly from the Führer. The offensive was already in motion, units moving into position, the timeline fixed. There was no possibility of delay. Von der Heydte would have his orders in writing by morning. He was dismissed. That night, von der Heydte sat alone in his temporary quarters and tried to calculate how thoroughly doomed the operation was. He had commanded paratroopers for 4 years. He understood exactly what was required to plan and execute a successful airborne assault. First, intelligence, detailed maps, aerial reconnaissance photos, information about enemy strength, and positions in the drop zone. Second, training. Weeks of rehearsals, practice jumps, coordination between air and ground elements. Third, equipment. Proper winter gear, adequate ammunition and supplies, reliable radios for communication. Fourth, air superiority. Control of the skies to protect slow-moving transport aircraft during the approach and drop. Fifth, experienced personnel. Veterans who had jumped before, who would not panic when the door opened and the night roared past. Sixth, a realistic objective, something actually achievable by airborne troops operating behind enemy lines with limited supplies and no immediate prospect of relief. The operation student had described met none of these criteria. Von der Heydte had no maps of the Baraque Michel crossroads beyond a standard military survey. He had no aerial photos. He knew nothing about American strength in the area except that it was behind their lines, which meant it was defended. 8 days allowed no time for meaningful training. Most of his troops would be jumping for the first time in combat, possibly jumping for the first time ever. Winter equipment was chronically short throughout the German military by December 1944. There was no chance of properly outfitting 1,200 men on 8 days' notice. The Luftwaffe had been bled nearly to death in 4 months of fighting since the Normandy invasion. Germany no longer had air superiority anywhere in the West. The skies belonged to the Americans and British, who had thousands of fighters and could respond to any German air activity within minutes. As for personnel, von der Heydte would get whoever the replacement system coughed up, the dregs and leftovers, boys and old men and soldiers returning from wounds, anyone the regular infantry divisions did not want. The objective itself was militarily questionable. Baraque Michel was indeed a crossroads, and denying it to the Americans would complicate their ability to shift reinforcements. But it was 11 kilometers behind American lines, in mountainous and forested terrain, in winter. How long could paratroopers hold such a position without resupply? Student had spoken vaguely about German armored columns reaching them within 2 days, but von der Heydte had fought in the Ardennes in 1940. He knew the roads were narrow and easily blocked, that winter weather could stop entire divisions in their tracks. The plan assumed everything would work perfectly: the drop, the assembly, the defense of the crossroads, the arrival of relief forces. Military operations never worked perfectly. This one would not even work adequately. It would fail catastrophically, and 1,200 men would pay the price. Over the next 2 days, von der Heydte received his written orders and began the impossible task of assembling Kampfgruppe von der Heydte. The men arrived in chaotic batches. 200 came from parachute training schools, instructors, and advanced students. At least they had jump experience. 800 came from replacement depots, recent conscripts who had been given truncated parachute courses. Most had made 1 or 2 practice jumps. Some had made none. 150 came from hospitals, men returning from wounds suffered in Normandy or the Eastern Front. They had combat experience but questionable physical fitness. The age range ran from 17 to 45. Some were veterans of Crete and North Africa, scarred and cynical. Others were boys who had been in Hitler Youth uniform 6 months earlier, terrified and trying to hide it. They spoke different dialects, came from different regions, had trained under different systems. They were not a regiment. They were a collection of strangers being asked to function as an elite unit within a week. Von der Heydte met with his hastily appointed officers and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. They had 6 days to turn this assemblage into something resembling a fighting force. 6 days to distribute equipment, conduct rehearsals, memorize objectives, establish communication procedures, build unit cohesion. It could not be done properly, but they would do the best they could because the alternative was sending the men in completely unprepared, which would be murder. They worked 18-hour days. They ran the men through basic parachute drills. They distributed what weapons and equipment were available: Mauser rifles, MP-40 submachine guns, MG-42 machine guns, a handful of Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. Winter clothing came up short. 300 men would jump without proper cold weather gear. Radios were in desperately short supply. Von der Heydte's command would have exactly 6 functioning radio sets to control 1,200 men scattered across a night drop zone. On December 10th, von der Heydte sat down and wrote a formal memorandum documenting his objections to the operation. He numbered them carefully: 14 separate fatal flaws in the plan. Insufficient training time. Inadequate personnel quality. No aerial reconnaissance. No detailed maps. No proven assembly procedures for night drops. Insufficient winter equipment. Radio shortage. Transport aircraft crews with minimal night formation experience. No Pathfinder teams to mark the drop zone. No contingency plans for scattered drops. American air superiority making approach flights suicidal. No realistic resupply plan. Distance behind enemy lines too great for link-up with ground forces. Drop zone selection based on maps, not aerial observation, meaning they might be dropping into forests or swamps or sheer mountainsides for all anyone knew. He wrote each point clearly, supported with specific evidence, and submitted the memorandum through channels. It was a remarkable document, both a legal protection for himself and a genuine attempt to stop the madness. In any professional military, it would have triggered an immediate review of the operation. Students' response arrived within 24 hours. The objections were noted. The operation would proceed as planned. The Führer had personally approved the offensive timeline. There could be no delay. Student added, almost as an afterthought, that he had complete confidence in von der Heydte's ability to overcome these challenges through tactical skill and leadership. It was the response von der Heydte had expected, but it still felt like a physical blow. Student knew the operation was doomed. Von der Heydte knew it was doomed. Everyone involved knew it was doomed. But the machinery of Hitler's Germany ground forward regardless, crushing objections beneath the weight of ideological certainty and desperate hope. The Führer had ordered an offensive. The offensive required an airborne component. Therefore, the airborne component would happen, reality be damned. Von der Heydte called his officers together and told them what he had learned in 4 years of commanding paratroopers. When the mission is impossible, the commander's duty is to preserve as many lives as possible while still attempting the objective. They would jump. They would try to seize the crossroads, but they would not waste lives in futile heroics. If the drop scattered them beyond recovery, they would make rational decisions about survival. If the objective proved untenable, they would withdraw rather than die for symbolism. He was giving them permission in advance to prioritize their men's lives over blind obedience. It was as close as he could come to mutiny without actually refusing orders. Some of the officers looked relieved. Others looked scandalized. All of them understood they were being asked to participate in a sacrifice, not an operation. The paratroopers themselves knew something was wrong. They were not stupid. They could see the chaos of the assembly, the shortage of equipment, the haunted look in their officers' eyes. Rumors spread through the barracks. They were dropping into France. No, Belgium. No, behind the Americans. No, the British. The mission was sabotage. No, it was reconnaissance. No, they were seizing a bridge, a crossroads, a headquarters. Nobody knew for certain because von der Heydte had not yet briefed them on the actual objective, partly for security reasons, but mostly because he kept hoping the operation would be canceled. Surely someone at OKW, the high command, would recognize the insanity and pull the plug. Surely the Luftwaffe would report that they lacked sufficient transport aircraft. Surely Hitler himself would realize that throwing away 1,200 paratroopers on a marginal objective during a risky offensive was strategic madness. December 15th arrived. The operation had not been canceled. Von der Heydte assembled his Kampfgruppe and briefed them on their mission. They would drop at 0300 hours on December 17th near the Baraque Michel crossroads in Belgium. Their objective was to block the roads and prevent American reinforcements from reaching the front during the critical first 48 hours of the offensive. German armored forces would reach them by December 18th. They would hold for 2 days, no more. Then they would be withdrawn and return to Germany as heroes who had helped win the great victory in the West. Von der Heydte delivered this speech knowing it was a lie. The men would not be relieved in 2 days. Many would not be relieved at all. But morale required optimism, and he gave them what optimism he could manufacture. That evening, von der Heydte walked through the barracks and spoke with his paratroopers. He found a 17-year-old from Bavaria who had joined the Hitler Youth at 14 and volunteered for paratrooper training at 16. He spoke with a 42-year-old veteran of Crete who had been wounded 3 times and was jumping one more time because the fatherland needed him. He met a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, a factory worker from the Ruhr, a farmer's son from East Prussia. They were not monsters. They were not fanatics. They were just men, wearing German uniforms in December 1944, about to be sent on a mission that would kill or capture most of them. Some were enthusiastic, still believing in victory. Others were quietly terrified, understanding more than they admitted. All of them were preparing to jump into winter darkness because their country had ordered them to, because refusing meant execution, because stopping the machinery of war required more courage than participating in it. The transport aircraft began arriving at the departure airfields on December 15th. 112 Junkers 52 trimotors, the workhorse of the Luftwaffe, slow and vulnerable and reliable. They came from training schools across Germany, pulled out of instructional service for one last combat mission. Their crews were a mix of veterans and novices. Some pilots had flown supply missions on the Eastern Front, dodging Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Others had spent the war teaching students in the relative safety of Bavaria. Now they were all being asked to fly a night formation mission through contested airspace to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines. The mission briefing for the pilots was almost as grim as von der Heydte's briefing for the paratroopers. They would fly low to avoid radar detection, which also made them vulnerable to ground fire. They would maintain radio silence, which meant navigation by dead reckoning and terrain features in darkness. They would drop their loads and return immediately, no loitering over the drop zone. Expected losses were euphemistically listed as acceptable, which everyone understood meant substantial. December 16th arrived, the day before the drop. The Great Offensive began at 05:30 with a massive artillery barrage along the American lines. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously, shattering the winter dawn, announcing Hitler's gamble to the world. Panzer divisions lurched forward through the Ardennes forests, smashing into surprised American positions. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Von der Heydte and his Kampfgruppe listened to the distant rumble of guns and knew their turn was coming. They drew parachutes and checked equipment. They ate a final hot meal. They wrote last letters home, or tried to sleep, or sat in nervous groups smoking and joking with the desperate humor of men facing death. Von der Heydte spent the day double-checking details he had already checked a dozen times, not because it would make any difference, but because commanders need tasks to fill the waiting hours. At 2200 hours on December 16th, the paratroopers began loading into the Junkers transports, 12 to 14 men per aircraft, laden with weapons and equipment and parachutes, shuffling up the boarding ramps into the cramped fuselages. The aircraft interiors smelled of hydraulic fluid and metal and fear. The men sat on metal benches facing each other, knees almost touching, trying to find comfortable positions under the weight of their gear. Von der Heydte walked among the aircraft, shaking hands, offering final words of encouragement, projecting a confidence he absolutely did not feel. Then he boarded his own aircraft, took his position by the door, and waited for engines to start. The night was cold and clear with scattered clouds. Snow covered the ground. Visibility was adequate for formation flying, which meant it was also adequate for American anti-aircraft gunners. Von der Heydte checked his watch. 2300 hours, one more hour, and they would be airborne. He thought about his memorandum, the 14 fatal flaws he had documented. Every single one of them was about to prove prophetic. The operation was launching exactly as he had predicted it would, chaotically, inadequately, with insufficient preparation and unrealistic expectations. In a just world, someone would have stopped it, but the world was not just, and Germany in December 1944 was not a place where rational military assessments outweighed ideological fantasy. The machinery had started. 1,200 men were about to be fed into it. All von der Heydte could do now was jump with them, try to lead them through whatever chaos awaited, and hope that history would record he had tried to prevent this. At 2330 hours, the first engines coughed he to life. Then another and another, until the night roared with the sound of 336 radial engines warming up. Von der Heydte closed his eyes briefly, said a prayer for his men, and accepted the inevitable. Operation Stösser had begun. December 16th, 1944, 23:45 hours. Paderborn-Lippspring Airfield, Western Germany. The first Junkers. 52 lurched down the runway, its 3 engines straining against the weight of 14 paratroopers and their equipment. Inside the fuselage, Gefreiter Hans Becker gripped the static line above his head and watched the red light by the door, waiting for it to turn green, knowing it would not change until they reached Belgium. The aircraft bounced and shuddered through the takeoff, finally clawing its way into the winter sky with the grinding determination of a machine operating at the edge of its capabilities. Below, another Junkers began its takeoff roll, then another, until the night sky filled with the distinctive silhouettes of German transport aircraft, 112 of them, carrying 1,200 men toward what they had been told was a strategic crossroads, but what was actually a patch of frozen Belgian forest that would become their graveyard. The plan called for the formation to assemble over the airfield before proceeding west toward Belgium, but assembling 112 aircraft in darkness with radio silence, flown by pilots of varying skill levels, proved immediately problematic. Some pilots climbed too quickly, eager to reach altitude. Others remained low, uncomfortable with night flying. The formation began to stretch, gaps appearing between aircraft that should have been maintaining close intervals. The Pathfinder aircraft, carrying the navigation team responsible for leading the formation to the correct drop zone, was supposed to be clearly marked with special lights. But those lights were barely visible at more than 100 meters, and within minutes of takeoff, half the formation had lost visual contact with the Pathfinder. They followed other aircraft instead, trusting that someone ahead of them knew where they were going. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also completely wrong. Inside von der Heydte's aircraft, the engine noise made conversation impossible. The paratroopers sat in darkness, alone with their thoughts, feeling every vibration of the airframe, wondering what waited at the end of this flight. Some had made combat jumps before, in the glory days of 1940 and 1941. They remembered how it felt when the door opened and the slipstream howled past, how the static line yanked the parachute out, how the opening shock felt like being kicked by a horse. They remembered the terrifying seconds of descent, totally exposed, watching the ground rush up, and they remembered landing, the impact that drove breath from lungs, the frantic need to shed the parachute harness and find cover before enemy fire found you. For them, this flight was familiar terror. For the others, the ones who had made one practice jump or two or none at all, this flight was the unknown made manifest. Every horror story they had heard about airborne operations compressed into this one moment. The formation crossed the German-Belgian border at approximately 00 hours on December 17th. Below them, the Ardennes forest stretched dark and uninviting, broken only by occasional villages showing no lights, blacked out against air raids. The pilots navigated by dead reckoning and terrain features they could barely see. The Rhine River should have been their primary navigation checkpoint, a clearly visible landmark even in darkness. But clouds obscured sections of the ground, and wind had pushed the formation slightly south of the planned route. When the Pathfinder aircraft spotted what they thought was the Rhine, they adjusted course. It was not the Rhine. It was a smaller river, and the course correction sent the entire formation several kilometers off track. The error would compound over the next hour, eventually delivering paratroopers to drop zones 20 kilometers from where they were supposed to be. At 0100 hours, the formation ran into American anti-aircraft fire. The cities of Bonn and Cologne were heavily defended, ringed with 90mm guns and 40mm Bofors batteries. Operated by crews who had been shooting at German aircraft for years and were very, very good at their jobs. The first Junkers to enter the defensive zone attracted searchlights immediately. The slow-moving transport, flying at less than 300 meters altitude, made a perfect target. The searchlight beam locked on, other lights joined it, and then the sky erupted with tracers and shell bursts. The pilot threw his aircraft into a desperate evasive maneuver, banking hard left, diving, scattering his formation. The paratroopers inside were thrown against the fuselage, equipment breaking loose, men cursing and praying as the aircraft shuddered from near misses. Behind the first aircraft, the rest of the formation saw the anti-aircraft fire and made individual decisions. Some pilots maintained course, trusting speed and altitude to carry them through. Others broke formation and dove, or climbed, or banked away from the threat. The neat columns of aircraft that had left Germany shattered into dozens of individual flights, each following its own navigation, each hoping to find the drop zone through skill or luck. Radio silence prevented any coordination. Each pilot was alone now, guessing at navigation points, watching fuel gauges, calculating whether they had enough gas to reach the drop zone, drop their paratroopers, and return to base. Some pilots made the calculation and did not like the answer. They would have to drop their loads earlier than planned, or risk running out of fuel over enemy territory. The anti-aircraft gauntlet over the Rhine cost Operation Stösser 5 aircraft shot down outright and another 8 damaged so severely they limped back toward Germany, leaking fuel and hydraulic fluid. The paratroops aboard the stricken aircraft never made it to the drop zone. They died in burning wreckage scattered across the German-Belgian border, or they survived crashes and were immediately captured by American forces who found them wandering the crash sites. 140 men, more than 10% of the force, were gone before the first parachute opened. But the greater damage was invisible. The complete disintegration of the formation. By 01:30 hours, there was no longer an Operation Stösser in any meaningful sense. There were 97 individual aircraft flying separate courses, heading toward what their pilots hoped was Belgium, carrying paratroopers who had no idea their mission was already destroyed. Oberst von der Heydte's aircraft was in the lead group, one of perhaps 20 Junkers that had managed to follow the Pathfinder through the anti-aircraft fire. They flew on through the darkness, the pilot desperately searching for landmarks. The drop zone at Baraque Michel was supposed to be identifiable by road intersections and the distinctive shape of the High Fens Plateau. But in winter darkness, with snow covering everything, one patch of forest looked exactly like another. The pilot saw what he thought might be the correct area. It was 02:55 hours, close enough to the planned drop time. He flashed the red light, signaling the paratroopers to prepare. Von der Heydte stood and hooked his static line to the cable running the length of the fuselage. Behind him, his men did the same. The aircraft slowed. The door opened and winter cold roared into the fuselage. The green light flashed. Von der Heydte jumped, felt the familiar shock of the slipstream, the hard jerk of the parachute deploying, then silence as he floated down through winter darkness. Below him, the ground was a shadow, details impossible to distinguish. He landed in snow, rolled, shrugged out of his harness, and immediately knew something was wrong. The terrain was not what the maps had shown. He was in forest, dense trees all around, not the open plateau near Baraque Michel. He pulled out his compass and tried to orient himself. Around him in the darkness, he heard impacts as other paratroopers landed, the distinctive sound of men hitting ground and snow. He heard someone call out the tactical recognition sign, a cricket noisemaker that was supposed to help scattered paratroopers find each other. He clicked his own cricket in response and heard answering clicks from several directions, but the clicks were spread out, dispersed across what sounded like hundreds of meters. This was not the concentrated drop he had planned. This was scatter. Across the Ardennes, the same scene repeated 96 more times over the next hour. Aircraft arrived at what pilots thought was the correct drop zone, or what they hoped might be close enough, or what they decided was as good as they were going to find. The green light flashed, and paratroopers jumped into winter darkness, trusting that ground rushing up to meet them was the right ground. Most landed in forest, some landed in swamps, crashing through ice into freezing water. A few landed in villages, coming down in streets or on rooftops, captured before they could even shed their parachutes. Many landed in areas that were not behind American lines at all, but rather in rear areas, crashing down near supply depots and field hospitals and headquarters, places thick with American troops who were very surprised to find German paratroopers descending from the sky, but quite capable of shooting or capturing them. The drop altitude varied wildly. Standard procedure called for jumps between 120 and 150 meters, high enough for parachutes to deploy safely, but low enough to minimize time in the air and exposure to ground fire. But panicked pilots, desperate to drop their loads and escape, dropped paratroopers from whatever altitude they happened to be flying. Some jumped from 300 meters or higher, drifting far from any assembly point during the long descent. Others jumped from dangerously low altitude, barely 100 meters, hitting the ground before they were fully oriented, sustaining broken bones and concussions from impacts that came too fast. At least 15 paratroopers died when their parachutes failed to deploy properly in the abbreviated fall, becoming dead weight crashing through trees or into frozen ground. Supply bundles containing heavy weapons and ammunition and extra rations were pushed out of the aircraft immediately after the paratroopers. But in the chaos of the scattered drop, most bundles landed nowhere near assembled troops. They hung in trees, or sank in swamps, or smashed into rocks, their contents scattered or destroyed. Von der Heydte's Kampfgruppe had jumped with 6 heavy machine guns, a dozen Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, extra ammunition, medical supplies, explosives for demolition work. 60% of this equipment was never recovered. The men landed with what they carried: rifles, personal ammunition loads, one day's rations, and increasingly little hope that this operation was anything other than a catastrophe. By 0400 hours, the last Junkers had dropped its load and turned for Germany. The pilots who survived the mission, and remarkably most did, German aircraft losses being lower than expected due to pure luck and American anti-aircraft gunners being focused on the larger Battle of the Bulge, reported various drop zones, various times, various levels of ground fire. When intelligence officers tried to compile these reports into a coherent picture of where the paratroopers had actually been dropped, they found it impossible. The drops had been scattered across a 25-kilometer radius, maybe more. Some pilots admitted they had no idea where they had dropped their men, that they had simply found a clear area and released the paratroopers, hoping it was close enough to the target. The sheer scale of the navigational failure was unprecedented. Airborne operations since the invention of the parachute had occasionally suffered from scattered drops, but nothing like this, nothing approaching this level of total dispersal. In the Ardennes forest, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, small groups of paratroopers struggled through snow and trees, clicking their crickets, calling out in hoarse whispers, trying to find comrades in the winter landscape. Some found a handful of men, 5 or 6 or 10, and formed impromptu squads. They were lost. They knew that much, but at least they were not alone. Others found no one. They wandered for hours, seeing no friendly faces, hearing no response to their signals. Some decided to head east, back toward German lines, abandoning the mission before it began. Others tried to navigate toward what they hoped was the objective, though few had any clear idea where the objective was or how to reach it. And some, exhausted from the jump and the cold and the horror of landing in unknown territory in darkness, simply found cover and went to ground, hoping daylight would clarify the situation. Von der Heydte spent the night searching for his command. He gathered 20 men by dawn, a pathetic fraction of the 1,200 who had jumped. His ankle, twisted in the landing, was swelling painfully inside his boot. He suspected it was broken but could not afford to stop and treat it. He needed to find more men, establish some kind of defensive position, determine where they actually were, and whether the mission objective was even reachable. He sent scouts in different directions with orders to search for 2 hours, then return. None of them found more than scattered individuals or tiny groups. By midday on December 17th, von der Heydte had assembled perhaps 40 paratroopers. Not 40%, not 40 platoons, 40 men total out of 1,200. The operation he had warned was impossible had proven even worse than his darkest predictions. The night of the Junkers had ended. The aircraft had returned to Germany, many damaged, a few lost, but most surviving. The pilots would fly again, on other missions, other operations. But Operation Stösser was over. It had died somewhere over Belgium in the darkness, not from enemy action, but from the accumulated weight of every shortcut and every ignored warning and every impossible demand. The aviation chaos had not merely scattered the drop, it had atomized it, breaking a regiment into individual soldiers spread across an area the size of a small city. There was no longer a Kampfgruppe von der Heydte. There were only hundreds of lost, confused, increasingly desperate men, alone in enemy territory, trying to decide whether to continue toward a mission they could not accomplish or simply try to survive. And across the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge raged on, German armor driving deep into American positions. Desperate fighting in villages and forests, the largest battle the U.S. Army would fight in Europe. Against this massive struggle, the scattered remnants of Operation Stösser were barely noticeable. A footnote, a few hundred prisoners captured here and there, some bodies found in the snow. The Americans never realized a major airborne operation had been attempted. The Germans never understood how completely it had failed. The paratroopers themselves knew only that they had jumped and landed and found themselves alone. The night of the junkers had scattered them into the void. Now came the harder part, staying alive long enough to find out if anyone was coming to get them. Most already suspected the answer. No one was coming. They were on their own. The operation had failed before they had left the aircraft, and now they would pay the price for decisions made by men who were safe in headquarters, warm and comfortable, planning the next phase of an offensive that assumed resources that did not exist and success that would never come. December 17th, 1944, 03:15 hours, 20 kilometers north of the intended drop zone. Lieutenant Eric Brandner slammed into a pine tree at approximately 40 kilometers per hour, his parachute lines tangling in branches 15 meters above the frozen ground. The impact drove the air from his lungs, snapped 2 ribs, and left him suspended in darkness, swaying gently in winter wind, unable to see the ground or determine if he was about to be cut down by American gunfire. He hung there for 5 minutes, listening to his own ragged breathing and the silence of the forest, before he managed to pull out his combat knife and begin cutting himself free. The drop was textbook procedure: cut the line systematically, control the descent, land ready to fight. But Brandner's hands were already numb from cold. His ribs sent spikes of pain through his chest with every breath, and when he finally cut the last line and dropped, he landed badly, wrenching his knee. He lay in snow for several minutes, taking inventory of his body, his equipment, his situation. His rifle had remained strapped to his side. His ammunition pouches were intact. His map and compass had survived. But he was alone wherever here was, and he could hear no other paratroopers, no signal clicks, no friendly voices. Brandner pulled out his compass and tried to orient himself. The maps he had been given showed the drop zone near Baraque, Michel, with specific terrain features he was supposed to recognize. But in darkness, with snow covering everything, he could identify nothing. He knew the general direction of German lines, east, but not how far he had been dropped from the intended zone, or whether he was behind American positions or somewhere in no man's land. Standard procedure was to move to the rally point and assemble with other paratroopers. But without knowing where he was, he could not navigate to a rally point he could not locate. He clicked his cricket noisemaker, the distinctive double click that identified him as German Airborne. No response. He clicked again, louder, then stopped, realizing that the sound could attract American patrols as easily as German paratroopers. He was trained for this scenario. Every paratrooper drilled endlessly on individual action after a scattered drop. But training scenarios assumed you were at least in the correct country, within a few kilometers of your objective, with some reasonable chance of linking up with friendly forces. By 0400 hours, Brandner had walked approximately 2 kilometers through dense forest, moving slowly to avoid noise, trying to find high ground where he could observe terrain features and determine his location. His ribs hurt with every step. His knee was swelling. The temperature had dropped to -15 Celsius, and his breath formed clouds that hung in the still air. He found a logging road, which at least confirmed he was in a forested area with some human activity. He followed the road for a kilometer, moving in the drainage ditch alongside it, ready to drop flat if he heard vehicles. At 0430 he heard voices, American voices, speaking English in casual tones, the sound of men who felt safe in their own rear area. Brandner froze, then slowly crawled into deeper cover. Through the trees, he saw lights, a building, several buildings actually, some kind of small supply depot or command post. American soldiers moved between the buildings, relaxed, smoking cigarettes, completely unaware that a German paratrooper was watching from 100 meters away. Brandner realized with sick certainty that he had been dropped not behind American front lines but behind their rear areas, deep in territory they controlled absolutely. This was not a tactical situation. This was a survival situation. He could not accomplish any military objective alone. He could not even safely move during daylight with American forces this close. He needed to go to ground, hide until dark, then try to move east toward German lines. He backed away from the depot carefully, found a dense thicket of brush, and crawled into it. He arranged pine branches for camouflage and insulation, ate a small portion of his rations, and settled in to wait for night. Around him, the Ardennes forest slowly lightened with dawn. He could hear aircraft overhead, American fighters and reconnaissance planes, the sound of an air force that controlled the sky absolutely. He thought about the mission briefing, about von der Heydte's promise that they would seize the crossroads and hold for 2 days until relief arrived. It seemed like a fantasy now, a story told to children. He was 26 years old, a veteran of Crete and North Africa, and he knew with absolute certainty that this operation had failed catastrophically. The only question was whether he would survive long enough to report that failure to someone who mattered. December 17th, 03:45 hours. Near Eupen, Belgium. Hauptmann Hans Joachim Kruk landed in a residential street, his parachute dragging him across cobblestones before he could release the harness. He came to rest against a stone wall, momentarily stunned, and looked up to see shutters opening in houses around him and faces appearing in windows. For one frozen moment, he hoped they were Belgian civilians who might hide him or at least ignore him. Then a door opened and an American soldier stepped out, wearing a helmet liner and carrying an M1 Garand rifle, looking as surprised as Kruk felt. They stared at each other for perhaps 3 seconds. Then Kruk reached for his holstered pistol, and the American brought his rifle up, and more Americans appeared from other buildings. And Kruk realized he was surrounded by what appeared to be an entire platoon billeted in this village. He raised his hands. There was no shame in surrender when resistance was suicidal. The Americans approached cautiously, clearly confused about why a German paratrooper had just dropped into their laps. Within 30 minutes, 7 more German paratroopers had been captured in the same general area, all having landed in or near the village of Eupen, all equally confused about where they were or why they had been dropped into what was obviously a rear area American position. The American unit, a military police detachment, radioed their captures to higher headquarters and received orders to hold the prisoners for intelligence interrogation. The MPs were professional and correct in their treatment, giving the Germans water and allowing them to warm themselves by a stove while guards kept weapons trained on them. Kruk, as the senior German officer present, was separated and questioned briefly. Where had he come from? How many others had jumped? What was the objective? Kruk gave his name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention and refused to answer tactical questions. But he was also quietly grateful to be a prisoner. He had been a paratrooper since 1940, had jumped into Poland and Holland and Crete, had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. He was 34 years old and exhausted, and some part of him was relieved that his war was over. The Americans asked if he wanted to help them locate other German paratroopers in the area. Kruk refused. He was a prisoner, not a collaborator. But he did not need to help. Over the next 6 hours, as dawn broke and American patrols spread out, they found German paratroopers throughout the region around Eupen. Most surrendered immediately when confronted. A few tried to evade but were tracked down by MPs who knew the area and had radios and vehicles. By noon on December 17th, the Americans had captured 43 German paratroopers in the Eupen sector alone, all confused about their mission, all scattered across a 5-kilometer radius, none aware of where their comrades were or whether the operation had succeeded. The Americans treated them well, gave them food and medical attention for minor injuries, and sent them to rear area prison camps. For these men, Operation Stösser had lasted less than 6 hours from jump to capture. They would spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire, wondering what had happened to the promised great offensive and whether any of their comrades had actually reached the objective. December 17th, 0400 hours, 5 kilometers northeast of Baraque, Michel. Oberst von der Heydte landed hard in a snow-covered clearing, felt something crack in his left ankle, and knew immediately he had broken bones. He rolled onto his back, released his parachute harness, and lay still for a moment, assessing the damage. The ankle was broken or severely sprained. He could feel it swelling already, but he could still move, and that was what mattered. Around him in the pre-dawn darkness, he heard the impacts of other paratroopers landing, but they sounded dispersed, scattered across a wide area. He pulled out his cricket and clicked it repeatedly. 3 answering clicks came back from different directions, all distant. Von der Heydte got to his feet, testing the ankle, and nearly collapsed from the pain. He wrapped it tightly with bandages from his first aid kit, used his rifle as a makeshift crutch, and began moving toward the nearest cricket sounds. It took him 2 hours to assemble 20 men, 2 hours of painful hobbling through forest and snow, clicking the cricket, calling out recognition codes, gathering soldiers who materialized from the darkness like ghosts. Some were from his personal staff, men he knew well. Others were strangers, privates, and corporals from the replacement battalions. Boys, really, looking to him for orders and reassurance he was not sure he could provide. They gathered in a small depression that offered some concealment and held a whispered conference. Von der Heydte asked each man where they had landed and what they had seen. The answers confirmed his worst fears. They were scattered across at least a 3-kilometer radius. No one had seen large groups of paratroopers. The supply bundles were nowhere to be found. And worst of all, no one could definitively say where they were in relation to the objective. Von der Heydte pulled out his map and compass, tried to correlate terrain features with what they could see in the growing dawn light, and made his best guess. They were somewhere northeast of Baraque, Michel, probably 4 or 5 kilometers off target. The tactical situation was clear and hopeless. With 20 men, he could not seize a defended crossroads. He could barely conduct reconnaissance, but von der Heydte was a professional soldier, and professionals did not surrender after 2 hours of operations simply because the situation was dire. He made a decision. They would move toward what he believed was Baraque, Michel, gathering any paratroopers they found along the way, and reassess once they had a better sense of how many men had survived the drop and where they had landed. It was a plan based more on hope than military logic, but it was a plan. The men responded to it because they needed to believe there was still a mission, still a purpose to their presence in this frozen forest. Von der Heydte sent out scouts in pairs, with orders to search for 1 hour, then return to report. He established a temporary base in the depression and tried to raise German forces on his radio. Static answered him. He tried different frequencies, different transmission protocols. Nothing but static. By midday on December 17th, von der Heydte had assembled approximately 120 men, a pathetic fraction of the 1,200 who had jumped. They came in ones and twos and small groups, emerging from the forest looking exhausted and confused. Many reported the same story. They had landed alone or with just a few others, had wandered for hours trying to find the rally point, had finally heard rumors that the Oberst was gathering forces at this location. Von der Heydte organized them into makeshift platoons, appointed leaders, distributed what ammunition and supplies they had among the group. He could see in their faces that they understood the operation had failed. But they were German soldiers, trained to follow orders, and he was the highest-ranking officer present. They would follow him, at least for now, at least until the situation clarified one way or another. The scouts returned with troubling reports. American forces were everywhere, not frontline combat troops, but support units, supply convoys, headquarters elements, the infrastructure that kept an army functioning. The paratroopers had not dropped behind the American front. They had dropped into the American rear, an area swarming with troops who were not expecting combat, but were certainly capable of it. Moving in daylight would be suicidal. Even moving at night would be extremely difficult with this many men. Von der Heydte gathered his officers and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. They were approximately 120 men in an area controlled by thousands of Americans. They had minimal supplies, no heavy weapons, and no radio contact with friendly forces. The original objective, seizing Baraque Michel, was probably impossible with their current strength, but they were not defeated yet. They would move to a better defensive position, continue trying to gather scattered paratroopers and reassess their options. December 18th. Evening. Von der Heydte's force had grown to nearly 300 men, the largest concentration of Stösser paratroopers anyone had found. They had occupied a forested hilltop near Monschau, establishing a defensive perimeter, sending out patrols to search for more scattered troops. But the situation was deteriorating. American patrols were increasingly active in the area, clearly aware that German forces were present, even if they did not understand the full scope. Radio attempts continued to produce only static, meaning no one in the German command structure knew where they were or that they needed help. Food was running low. Some men had lost their rations in the jump. Others had eaten everything they had, assuming resupply would come quickly. Von der Heydte ordered strict rationing, 1/3 rations per day, which meant each man ate approximately 300 calories, nowhere near enough for soldiers operating in winter conditions. The cold was becoming as much of an enemy as the Americans. Temperatures at night dropped to -18 Celsius. Men who had jumped without proper winter gear, and there were many, suffered from frostbite within hours. Fingers and toes turned white, then black. Some men could no longer hold their rifles. Others could not walk without help. Von der Heydte's medical officer did what he could with limited supplies, but there was no treatment for exposure except warmth, and they could not risk lighting fires that would reveal their position. The men huddled together for warmth, sharing what blankets and coats they had, but it was never enough. By December 19th, von der Heydte had 3 men dead from exposure and another dozen in critical condition, unable to fight, barely able to move. Von der Heydte held another conference with his officers. The ammunition situation was critical, approximately 12 rounds per rifle, 200 rounds per machine gun. 3 Panzerfaust rockets for the entire force. If they were attacked by any significant American force, they could fight for perhaps 30 minutes before running out of ammunition. The food situation was worse. At current ration levels, they had perhaps 2 days of food remaining, and men were already weakening from hunger and cold. The medical situation was catastrophic. They had wounded who needed evacuation, frostbite cases who needed hospitalization, and von der Heydte's own ankle had become infected, the flesh around the break hot and swollen, early signs of gangrene. They could not hold this position indefinitely. They could not attack anything. They could not be resupplied. And increasingly, it was becoming clear that no one was coming to rescue them. December 20th. Morning. Von der Heydte made the hardest decision of his military career. He assembled his men and told them the truth. The operation had failed, relief was not coming, and their choices were stark. They could surrender as a group, which would save lives but meant prison camp for the remainder of the war. They could try to fight through to German lines as a unit, which would mean a running battle through American-controlled territory with minimal supplies and ammunition. Or he could dissolve the command, releasing each man to make his own way back to German lines, moving individually or in small groups, using stealth instead of force. Von der Heydte recommended the third option. As individuals or small groups, they had a chance of evading American patrols and reaching safety. As a large formation, they were too visible, too slow, too vulnerable. He was releasing them from their military obligation to follow his orders. Each man could decide his own fate. The men received this announcement in stunned silence. Some looked relieved, grateful for permission to prioritize survival over mission. Others looked betrayed, as if von der Heydte was abandoning them. A few argued for staying together, insisting that German soldiers did not scatter like bandits, but fought as units. Von der Heydte understood their feelings, but remained firm. He had led these men into an impossible situation on orders he had tried to refuse. He would not lead them to pointless deaths because military tradition demanded they die together. He gave them what information he had about the tactical situation, suggested routes toward German lines, offered what supplies could be shared, and then dismissed them. Over the next few hours, groups formed and departed. Some went in pairs, others in squads of 5 or 6. A few veterans chose to go alone, trusting only themselves. By evening, the hilltop was nearly empty. Approximately 30 men remained, those too wounded to travel, and those who insisted on staying with von der Heydte. Von der Heydte himself could barely walk. His ankle was grotesquely swollen, the infection spreading visibly. He knew he would not make it to German lines on foot. He also knew that staying here meant eventual capture. American forces were closing in, their patrols more aggressive each day. On the morning of December 21st, he made his final decision. He sent away the last of his men, keeping only his personal aide. Then he and the aide began walking toward American lines, not evading, not hiding, but walking openly down a forest road, 2 German officers surrendering themselves. They reached an American outpost of the 99th Infantry Division shortly before noon. Von der Heydte identified himself, requested medical treatment for his ankle, and became a prisoner of war. His war was over. Operation Stösser was over. What remained were scattered men in the forest, trying to survive, trying to reach home, each writing his own ending to a mission that had ended before it began. The scattering of the paratroopers continued for weeks. Some reached German lines within days, evading American patrols through luck and skill. Others wandered for 2 weeks or more, stealing food, hiding in barns, moving only at night. Many were captured, adding to the growing number of German prisoners taken during the Battle of the Bulge. Some simply disappeared, their fates unknown, bodies never recovered or identified. The Americans who captured them remained confused about what operation they had been part of. The Germans who received survivors were equally confused about what had happened. And the men themselves, the paratroopers of Operation Stösser, carried with them the knowledge that they had been sent on a mission that could not succeed, had survived by abandoning that mission, and would spend the rest of their lives wondering if there was something, anything, they could have done differently. The answer was no. They had been scattered by forces beyond their control, by decisions made before they boarded the aircraft, by a military machine that consumed men without regard for possibility or reason. They were the scattered, the lost, the survivors of an operation that vanished into history because it never cohered enough to become history. And their stories, when finally told, would reveal just how completely an army could fail its soldiers, while those soldiers continued trying to be what their country asked them to be: brave, loyal, and doomed. December 18th, 1944. 1400 hours. Forested hilltop near Monschau. Friedrich von der Heydte sat with his back against a tree, his infected ankle throbbing with each heartbeat, and faced a simple question with no good answer. What did a commander owe men in an impossible situation? He had gathered his officers for a council of war, though calling it war was generous when they had 300 men, no heavy weapons, dwindling ammunition, and American forces on all sides. The officers sat in a rough circle, speaking in low voices to avoid detection, each of them understanding they were discussing not how to win, but how to lose with minimum casualties. It was not the conversation any of them had imagined having when they volunteered for airborne service, but it was the conversation their situation demanded. Von der Heydte let them speak first, hearing their assessments, their suggestions, their barely concealed desperation. Hauptmann Werner Schacht, one of the few experienced officers who had jumped with the Kampfgruppe, argued for an immediate breakout attempt toward German lines. The Battle of the Bulge was still raging to their south. If they moved quickly, they might reach advancing German armored columns that could provide cover and support. It was risky. They would have to fight through American positions with inadequate ammunition, but staying put meant eventual capture or death from exposure. Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer disagreed. A 300-man column could not move undetected through American-controlled territory. They would be spotted immediately and destroyed piecemeal. Better to stay hidden, conserve ammunition, and wait for the German advance to reach them. Von der Heydte listened without comment, knowing both arguments had merit and both ignored the fundamental problem. There were no good options remaining, only choices between different types of failure. A third officer, Lieutenant Paul Becker, suggested something no one else wanted to say aloud. They should consider surrender. Not immediately, not without attempting something, but surrender as a planned option if circumstances deteriorated further. The words hung in the cold air like blasphemy. German officers, especially paratroopers, did not discuss surrender. They fought until victory or death. That was the culture, the expectation, the unspoken contract. But Becker was a veteran of the Eastern Front, had seen entire armies encircled and destroyed, knew what happened when ideology overrode tactical sense. Surrendering now, while they still had leverage and could negotiate terms, was preferable to being hunted down in the forest like animals. Several officers bristled at the suggestion. One muttered that Becker should be careful about defeatist talk. Von der Heydte raised a hand for silence. He understood the resistance to Becker's suggestion, but he also understood that Becker was the only one being completely honest about their situation. Von der Heydte had spent 4 years commanding men in combat. He had led paratroopers through the chaos of Crete, where German airborne forces suffered catastrophic casualties, capturing an island they ultimately had to abandon. He had commanded in North Africa, where the Afrika Korps fought brilliantly and lost anyway. He had fought in Normandy, watching the Wehrmacht bleed itself white, trying to hold positions that strategic reality had already rendered untenable. He had learned, slowly and painfully, that courage and skill were not always enough, that sometimes the most important decision a commander made was recognizing when a mission had become impossible and acting accordingly. And Operation Stösser had been impossible from the beginning. He had documented that impossibility in writing, had protested to his superiors, had been overruled. Now he sat in a frozen forest with a fraction of his force, cut off and surrounded, and he had to decide how many more lives to spend on a mission that had failed before they left the ground. The discussion continued for another hour, cycling through variations of the same 3 options: attack toward German lines, defend this position, or surrender. But von der Heydte's mind was moving toward a 4th option, one that would later be called either cowardice or wisdom, depending on who told the story. He could dissolve the command. He could release his men from their obligation to follow orders, tell them to make their own decisions about survival versus mission, split them into small groups that would have better chances of evasion than a large formation. It violated every principle of military organization. A commander did not abandon his command. Units fought together, held together, surrendered together. Dissolving the command meant admitting the mission was not just difficult, but completely unachievable. It meant telling 300 men that their jump, their comrades' deaths, their suffering in this frozen forest had been for nothing. It meant accepting responsibility for failure at a level that could haunt him for the rest of his life. But it also meant giving them the best possible chance of survival. Von der Heydte understood the mathematics of their situation. As a 300-man formation, they were a target, visible to American reconnaissance, vulnerable to overwhelming force, incapable of the stealth necessary to evade or the firepower necessary to fight. But as individuals or small groups, using the forest and darkness for concealment, they might slip through American positions and reach German lines. Not all of them, probably not even most of them, but some would make it, and that was better than the alternative. Keeping them together for the sake of military tradition would not save lives. It would only ensure they died as a unit instead of as individuals, which might be more aesthetically pleasing to military historians, but was cold comfort to the men doing the dying. Von der Heydte tested the idea on his officers. What if he released the men to find their own way home? The initial response was visceral rejection. It was dishonorable, they said. It was abandoning responsibility. It was admitting defeat before exhausting all options. Von der Heydte listened, then asked a simple question. What was more important, preserving the abstract concept of unit cohesion or preserving the actual lives of the men under his command? Because those 2 goals were now in direct conflict, and he could choose one or the other, but not both. The question created uncomfortable silence. These were professional officers, raised on Prussian military traditions that emphasized duty and discipline and collective sacrifice. But they were also human beings who had watched men die from wounds and exposure over the past 2 days, who understood intellectually, if not emotionally, that more deaths were coming unless something changed. Hauptmann Schacht, who had argued for the breakout, slowly nodded. He saw von der Heydte's logic, even if he hated it. A dispersed withdrawal gave individual men agency, allowed them to use judgment and initiative, turned survival into a personal mission rather than a collective sacrifice. Lieutenant Becker, the Eastern Front veteran, agreed immediately. He had seen too many units destroyed because commanders refused to acknowledge reality until it was too late. Better to release the men now, while they still had strength and options, than to wait until they were too weak to move or too surrounded to escape. Other officers remained unconvinced, arguing that German soldiers did not scatter like bandits, that their duty was to continue fighting regardless of circumstances. Von der Heydte respected their position but no longer agreed with it. He had followed orders he knew were wrong, had jumped with men he knew were insufficiently trained, had attempted a mission he knew was impossible, all because the military system demanded obedience over judgment. He would not compound those mistakes by sacrificing more lives to tradition. December 19th, evening. The situation deteriorated faster than von der Heydte had anticipated. American patrols were closing in, their activity increasing hourly. His men had fought 2 brief skirmishes during the day, expending precious ammunition for no tactical gain. Casualties were mounting not from combat but from cold and starvation. 2 more men had died during the night, simply not waking up, their bodies frozen in their sleeping positions. The medical officer reported that at least 20 men had severe frostbite requiring immediate hospitalization. Von der Heydte's own condition was worsening. The infection in his ankle had spread up his leg, red lines tracking toward his knee, classic signs of blood poisoning. He was feverish, his thinking occasionally clouded, and he knew he had perhaps 2 or 3 days before the infection either killed him or incapacitated him completely. He could no longer pretend to be an effective combat commander. He could barely walk. He could not lead an attack or a retreat or a defense. The most useful thing he could do for his men was release them from obligation to follow him. He assembled the Kampfgruppe in small groups, no more than 40 men at a time, to avoid presenting a concentrated target, and gave each group the same speech. The operation had failed through no fault of theirs. They had jumped as ordered, had attempted to assemble despite impossible dispersion, had maintained discipline in circumstances that would have broken lesser units. But the mission was no longer achievable. No relief was coming. The German advance had stalled short of their position. They were surrounded by American forces, with minimal supplies and no prospect of resupply. As their commander, he could order them to continue fighting, to hold this position until overrun, to die heroically for no strategic purpose, or he could release them to make their own choices. He was choosing the latter. Any man who wanted to attempt reaching German lines had his permission and blessing. Any man who preferred to surrender had no judgment from him. Any man who wanted to stay with the wounded and surrender as a group could do so. He would not order them anymore. He had led them into this disaster on orders from above. He would not lead them to pointless deaths. The reactions varied as widely as the men themselves. Some looked relieved, grateful for permission to prioritize survival. Others looked angry, feeling betrayed or abandoned. A few veterans approached von der Heydte privately and told him they understood his decision, that it was the right call even if it felt wrong. One young private, no more than 18 years old, asked what he should do. Von der Heydte told him to find 2 or 3 men he trusted, move east at night, avoid American positions, steal food if necessary, and try to reach the village of Monschau, where German forces might still be operating. The boy nodded, looking terrified and determined in equal measure, and walked away to find companions. Von der Heydte watched him go and wondered if he would survive. Probably not, but he had a better chance moving in a small group than staying here, waiting for American forces to finish them. Over the next 12 hours, the Kampfgruppe dissolved. Men formed small groups based on friendship or regional loyalty or simple proximity. Veterans paired with novices, hoping experience might compensate for the youngsters' lack of skills. A few men chose to go alone, trusting no one but themselves. They took what supplies could be spared: a handful of ammunition, a day's rations, a map if available, and slipped away into the forest. Von der Heydte shook hands with as many as he could, wished them luck, told them they had performed as well as any paratroopers in German history, and the failure of the mission reflected no discredit on them. Some believed him, others clearly did not. All of them understood this was the end of Operation Stösser as any kind of organized operation. Now it was just survival, individual men trying to stay alive long enough to see home again. December 20th, afternoon. Von der Heydte was left with approximately 30 men, mostly wounded who could not travel, plus a handful who refused to abandon their commander. He appreciated their loyalty but recognized it as misplaced. He could not lead them anywhere. He could barely stand. The infection had reached his knee, the legs swollen grotesquely, streaked with red and purple, hot to the touch. He needed antibiotics and surgery, or he would lose the leg, possibly his life. His aide, a Feldwebel named Karl-Heinz Müller, who had been with him since North Africa, suggested they surrender together. The Americans had field hospitals, doctors, medicine. Von der Heydte would receive proper treatment as a prisoner. Müller could ensure he received it, could act as translator and advocate. It was time to accept that the war was over for them. Von der Heydte spent December 20th preparing for surrender, as if preparing for battle, with the same attention to detail and concern for his men's welfare. He ensured the wounded were gathered in positions where American forces would find them easily. He wrote letters to the families of men who had died, knowing the letters would be censored or destroyed, but writing them anyway because it was what a commander did. He destroyed operational documents that might compromise ongoing German operations, though by this point, the Battle of the Bulge's outcome was becoming clear, and his scattered Kampfgruppe was strategically irrelevant. He prepared a statement explaining his actions, his protests before the operation, his decisions during it, his reasons for dissolving the command. He knew he would face investigation, possibly courts-martial, if Germany somehow won the war or survived to conduct such proceedings. He wanted his reasoning documented, wanted history to understand that he had tried to save lives, not abandon duty. On the morning of December 21st, von der Heydte and Müller began walking toward American lines. They carried a white flag improvised from a parachute panel. They walked slowly, von der Heydte leaning heavily on Müller, his ruined ankle dragging uselessly. They chose a logging road that ran roughly west, toward areas they knew were American-controlled, and walked openly, making no attempt to hide. The cold was brutal, -20°C, the sky gray with approaching snow. Von der Heydte's fever made him alternately sweat and shiver, his mind drifting occasionally into delirium, pulled back by Müller's steady voice. They walked for approximately 2 hours, covering perhaps 3 kilometers, before an American patrol spotted them. The patrol approached cautiously, weapons ready, clearly confused about why 2 German officers were walking down a road carrying a white flag. Von der Heydte stopped, waited for them to come closer, and identified himself in careful English. He was Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, commander of the German Airborne forces that had jumped 3 nights earlier. He was surrendering himself and requesting medical treatment. He had wounded men at a position approximately 3 kilometers back who also needed medical attention. The American sergeant in charge of the patrol stared at him for a long moment, trying to process this information. They had captured scattered German paratroopers over the past few days, but had not realized they were part of a major operation. An entire regiment? Jumped where? The sergeant radioed for instructions, then escorted von der Heydte and Müller to the headquarters of the 99th Infantry Division. The American intelligence officers who interrogated von der Heydte were professional, and once they understood his medical condition, compassionate. They arranged immediate transport to a field hospital where a surgeon examined his ankle and shook his head grimly. The infection had progressed to the point where amputation was a real possibility. They started him on heavy doses of sulfa drugs, the best antibiotics available, in December 1944, and told him the next 48 hours would determine whether they could save the leg. Von der Heydte lay in a hospital bed for the first time in 4 days, warm and clean and eating hot food, and felt the weight of command lift from his shoulders. His war was over. His men were scattered across Belgium, some dead, some captured, some still evading. He had failed to accomplish his mission, but he had done what he could to preserve lives, and he would defend that decision to anyone who questioned it. The interrogations began the next day and continued for weeks. The Americans wanted to understand everything: how many men had jumped, where they had landed, what their objective was, why the operation had failed so spectacularly. Von der Heydte answered carefully, providing information that was no longer operationally sensitive while protecting details that might endanger German forces still fighting. He described the impossibility of the mission, the inadequate preparation, his written protests. He explained the dispersion of the drop, the scattered assembly, the decision to dissolve his command. The interrogators took detailed notes, occasionally expressing shock at the conditions under which the operation had been launched. One American major told him bluntly that no competent military organization would have attempted such an operation with such resources. Von der Heydte agreed, but competence and German military planning in December 1944 were not closely correlated. Over the following months, as the war ground toward its conclusion, von der Heydte's interrogations continued. He provided a comprehensive account of Operation Stösser that would become the primary historical source for understanding what happened. He described the recruitment of his Kampfgruppe, the chaotic training, the disastrous drop, the scattered assembly, and his ultimate decision to release his men. He was candid about his own role, accepting responsibility for decisions he had made while also documenting the impossible circumstances imposed on him. The American interrogators compiled his testimony into reports that were filed away in intelligence archives, where historians would rediscover them decades later. Von der Heydte never expressed regret for dissolving his command. He regretted accepting the mission in the first place, regretted not refusing the orders more forcefully, regretted every death that occurred under his leadership. But he did not regret giving his men the choice to save themselves. It was the only decision he had made during Operation Stösser that he could defend with a clear conscience. His ankle eventually healed without amputation, though he would walk with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life. The infection left permanent damage to the joint, a physical reminder of those 4 days in December 1944. In later years, when the pain flared during cold weather, he would remember the frozen forest near Monschau, the faces of the men he had released to find their own way home, the weight of command in an impossible situation. He would remember standing before 300 men and telling them he could no longer lead them, that they would have to save themselves because he had nothing left to give them. It was the moment when military tradition and human compassion collided most completely in his life, and he had chosen compassion. History would debate whether that choice was courage or cowardice, wisdom or weakness. But for the men whose lives were possibly saved by that choice, the debate was irrelevant. Von der Heydte had released them, and some of them had survived because of it. The remaining wounded at the hilltop position were found by American forces on December 22nd. They surrendered without resistance and received medical treatment. 2 more men died before reaching hospitals, their bodies too damaged by cold and infection to recover. The others survived to spend the remainder of the war in prison camps, trading stories with other captured German soldiers, trying to understand what had happened to Operation Stösser and why no one seemed to know about it. They learned that their operation had become invisible, that the American intelligence summaries barely mentioned German paratroopers, that even the German high command seemed confused about what had occurred. They had jumped into history and vanished, becoming footnotes in a larger battle, survivors of an operation that failed so completely it ceased to be an operation at all. Von der Heydte's choice to dissolve his command rather than sacrifice it to military tradition would echo through military ethics discussions for decades. It represented a moment when a commander placed immediate human welfare above abstract concepts of duty and honor. In an army that increasingly demanded fanatical resistance regardless of circumstances, that increasingly punished commanders who retreated or surrendered even when resistance was militarily insane, von der Heydte's decision was remarkable. He had not waited for his men to be destroyed. He had not fought to the last man for the glory of the fatherland. He had looked at an impossible situation, calculated the mathematics of death, and chosen to minimize casualties rather than maximize heroism. It was the decision of a professional soldier who understood that bravery without purpose was simply waste. But it was also the decision of a man who knew he could not save everyone, who understood that even releasing his men only gave them chances, not guarantees. In the weeks that followed, as reports filtered back about scattered paratroopers captured or killed trying to reach German lines, von der Heydte would wonder if he had merely prolonged their suffering rather than ended it. Would they have been better off surrendering as a group on December 18th? Would a coordinated breakout attempt have saved more lives than individual evasion? These questions had no answers, only endless speculation. What was certain was that von der Heydte had given his men the dignity of choice in a military system that usually allowed none. He had told them the truth about their situation and allowed them to decide their own fates. Some had chosen to fight toward German lines. Others had surrendered. A few had succeeded in evading capture, but all of them had made their own decisions, and that agency mattered even if the outcomes were tragic. The human dimension of von der Heydte's choice became clearer in the decades after the war, when survivors began gathering for reunions and sharing their stories. Many spoke of the moment when he released them as the most surreal experience of their military service. They had been trained to follow orders, to subordinate individual judgment to command decisions, to function as parts of a military machine. And suddenly they were individuals again, responsible for their own survival, freed from the obligation to die for objectives they knew were unachievable. Some had thrived in that freedom, using initiative and intelligence to evade capture. Others had floundered, paralyzed by the absence of orders, uncertain how to function outside military structure. But nearly all of them, even those who criticized von der Heydte's decision as abandonment, acknowledged that he had given them something valuable: the choice to survive on their own terms rather than die on someone else's orders. Von der Heydte himself rarely spoke publicly about Operation Stösser after the war. He became a law professor, taught international law at Würzburg University, served as a reserve officer in the Bundeswehr, the new German military. He wrote memoirs that touched on his wartime service, but focused more on the moral and legal questions raised by total war. When pressed about Stösser, he would say only that it was an example of what happened when political desperation overrode military judgment, when ideology demanded victories that reality could not provide. He defended his men absolutely, insisted they had performed courageously under impossible circumstances, rejected any suggestion that their failure reflected on their quality as soldiers. But he also never claimed the operation could have succeeded with better execution. It had been doomed from conception, and all the courage and skill in the world could not salvage a mission designed to fail. His final reflection on the operation came in an interview conducted in the 1970s when he was in his 70s and knew his time was limited. The interviewer asked if he regretted his military career, given that he had fought for a regime he privately despised. Von der Heydte thought for a long time before answering. He said he regretted nothing about his service to his men, but regretted much about his service to the state. He had tried to be a good commander, which sometimes meant being a bad Nazi. He had tried to preserve lives, which sometimes meant questioning orders. And on one frozen hilltop in December 1944, he had made the choice that defined his career. He had chosen his men over his mission, humanity over duty, survival over sacrifice. It had cost him his command, damaged his reputation, and haunted him for 3 decades. But given the same choice again, he would make the same decision, because the alternative, leading 300 men to their deaths for the sake of military aesthetics, was not something he could live with. The interviewer asked if he considered himself a hero or a coward. Von der Heydte smiled sadly and said he was neither. He was simply a soldier who had learned, too slowly and at too high a cost, that following orders was sometimes the greatest betrayal of the men under his command. When Friedrich von der Heydte died in 1979, his obituary mentioned Operation Stösser as one of many campaigns he had participated in during the war. Most readers would have glossed over it, just another battle in a war full of battles. But for the survivors of that operation, scattered across Germany and beyond, his death marked the passing of a man who had tried to save them when no one else would. They remembered him standing in a frozen forest, his ankle shattered, his command disintegrating, making the choice that most commanders would have refused to make. They remembered his honesty about the situation, his refusal to lie about their chances, his willingness to accept responsibility for a decision that violated every principle of his training. And they remembered that some of them had lived because of that decision, had made it home, had survived the war, and built families and lived full lives. Not all of them. Too many had died in the forest, or in prison camps, or in the final chaos of Germany's collapse. But some had survived, and those survivors carried von der Heydte's memory as a reminder that even in the machinery of total war, even in an army that demanded absolute obedience, one man could choose to value human life over institutional expectation. It was a small victory in an ocean of defeat, but it was the only victory Operation Stösser produced, the proof that a commander could still choose his men over his mission, even when that choice cost everything. December 17th, 1944. 0900 hours. Headquarters, 6th SS Panzer Army, near Losheim, Germany. The radio operators sat at their stations, headphones clamped over their ears, carefully logging each transmission from the advancing panzer divisions. The offensive was proceeding according to plan mostly. American resistance was stiffer than anticipated in some sectors, weaker in others. Fuel shortages were already complicating the advance, a chronic problem that planners had acknowledged but not solved. But the radio operators were also listening for a different signal, a transmission from Kampfgruppe von der Heydte, the airborne force that was supposed to have seized Baraque Michel crossroads by dawn. They had been instructed to report in immediately upon securing the objective. The radio operators had been waiting for 4 hours. No transmission had come. They cycled through designated frequencies, sent out call signs, requested acknowledgement. Only static answered them. The silence stretched from minutes to hours, and the radio operators began exchanging worried glances. Something had gone wrong with the airborne operation, but what and how badly they could not determine. Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Mohnke, operations officer for 6th SS Panzer Army, reviewed the morning's intelligence summaries and frowned. The Baraque Michel crossroads was supposed to be in German hands, blocked against American reinforcement. 3 panzer columns were routing their advances to pass through or near that crossroads, counting on the paratroopers to keep the roads open. But the latest reconnaissance reports showed American forces still holding the crossroads, apparently unaware they were supposed to be under attack. Mohnke ordered additional radio attempts to contact von der Heydte. Still nothing. He considered the possibility that the airborne force had been delayed, that the drop had occurred but assembly was taking longer than expected. But by noon, with still no word, he was forced to consider that something catastrophic had happened. The operation planners had warned that airborne operations were risky, that dispersion was always a concern, but total communication failure, that suggested disaster on a scale Mohnke did not want to contemplate. By afternoon, the first panzer columns reached the approaches to Baraque Michel and encountered American resistance. Not light resistance, not disorganized stragglers, but organized defensive positions held by troops who clearly had not been disrupted by any airborne assault. The panzer commanders radioed back confused reports. Where were the paratroopers? The crossroads was supposed to be cleared. Instead, the Americans were dug in and prepared, forcing the armored columns to deploy for a set-piece assault that would cost hours and casualties. Monka realized with sinking certainty that Operation Stösser had failed, though he had no idea how or why. The airborne force had simply vanished. 1,200 men dropped into darkness and disappeared so completely that their absence was barely noticed in the larger chaos of the offensive. He sent urgent queries to Luftwaffe Command, demanding information about the drop. The responses were vague and unsatisfying. The aircraft had departed on schedule. Most had returned. Drops had occurred. Beyond that, pilots reported scattered information, contradictory details, nothing that explained the complete communications blackout. The senior commanders of 6th SS Panzer Army, including Sepp Dietrich himself, held a conference on the evening of December 17th to assess the offensive's progress. The Baraque Michel situation came up immediately. The crossroads remained in American hands, forcing major route adjustments for advancing columns. The delays were cascading through the operational timeline, pushing back objectives, consuming fuel, costing momentum. Someone asked about the paratroopers. Dietrich, a brutal and effective commander who had little patience for excuses, demanded to know what had happened to von der Heydte's force. No one could tell him. The operation had launched, but beyond that, information was non-existent. Dietrich ordered a ground reconnaissance toward the drop zones to search for the paratroopers. The reconnaissance patrols found nothing. No concentrated German forces, no signs of a major airborne landing. A few patrols reported contact with small groups of German soldiers who claimed to be paratroopers but were so dispersed they had no tactical significance. Dietrich concluded that the airborne operation had failed utterly and ordered his staff to stop counting on it. The offensive would proceed without the support that Operation Stösser was supposed to provide. But here was the remarkable thing. The failure of Operation Stösser barely registered in German command assessments of the offensive. The Battle of the Bulge was so massive, involving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles across a 100-kilometer front, that the loss of 1,200 paratroopers was a rounding error. The offensive had bigger problems. Fuel shortages that stranded entire panzer divisions, American resistance that stiffened after the initial surprise, weather that grounded the Luftwaffe while allowing American aircraft to operate freely, overly optimistic operational timelines that assumed everything would work perfectly. In that context, the failure to secure one crossroads was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. 6th SS Panzer Army continued its advance, adapting routes, accepting delays, grinding forward through sheer momentum and courage. The paratroopers were forgotten within days, their contribution to the offensive reduced to a footnote in situation reports. Airborne operation did not achieve objectives. Status of forces unknown. The German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, received similar reports and drew similar conclusions. Operation Stösser had failed, though the exact details remained murky. Some staff officers speculated that the Luftwaffe had botched the drop, delivering paratroopers to wrong locations or suffering heavy losses to American anti-aircraft fire. Others suggested von der Heydte had been too cautious, had failed to press the attack with sufficient aggression. A few quietly wondered if the operation had been viable in the first place, but these doubts were not expressed loudly in an organization where questioning the Führer's directives was career-ending or life-ending. The official explanation settled into a comfortable narrative. The operation had been sound in concept, but had suffered from execution failures at lower levels. Weather, Luftwaffe competence, bad luck. These were blamed rather than the fundamental impossibility of the mission. It was easier to blame execution than planning. Easier to scapegoat pilots and paratroopers than to acknowledge that the operation should never have been launched. Hitler himself demanded an investigation into the failure of Operation Stösser, though his attention was increasingly focused on the larger Battle of the Bulge and its disappointing progress. The investigation, conducted by Luftwaffe staff officers, concluded that primary responsibility lay with transport pilot incompetence and adverse weather conditions. The report acknowledged that the paratroopers had been assembled hastily and that training time was inadequate, but it suggested these challenges could have been overcome with better execution. Von der Heydte, captured and unavailable to defend himself, was mentioned briefly as having performed adequately given circumstances but failing to achieve objectives. The report was filed and forgotten. Germany had larger problems by January 1945 than determining exactly why one airborne operation had failed. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Western Front was being pushed back. The Reich was dying, and in that death spiral, the fate of 1,200 paratroopers was irrelevant. On the American side, the intelligence picture was even more confused. The captured paratroopers presented a puzzle that American intelligence officers struggled to solve. They had taken over 150 German prisoners who all claimed to be airborne troops, who all told stories of being dropped from aircraft in the early hours of December 17th. But American anti-aircraft batteries had not reported shooting down significant numbers of transport aircraft. Radar stations had not detected massed formations of aircraft penetrating American airspace. Forward units had not reported any concentrated airborne landings. The intelligence officers initially classified the prisoners as special operations troops, small teams inserted for reconnaissance or sabotage purposes. It was the only explanation that fit the scattered nature of the captures and the complete absence of any large-scale airborne presence. The interrogations revealed contradictions that frustrated the interrogators. Some prisoners spoke of jumping with hundreds of others. Others claimed to have been part of a massive operation involving over 1,000 men. But if such an operation had occurred, where was the evidence? Where were the mass parachute drops, the defensive positions, the coordinated attacks on American infrastructure? The prisoners' stories suggested an airborne regiment had jumped into the Ardennes. The evidence suggested scattered individuals and small groups. The interrogators wrote reports, noting the discrepancy, but offering no conclusion about what had actually happened. American intelligence summaries for December 17th through 21st mention German paratroopers only in passing as minor curiosities in the larger Battle of the Bulge narrative. What the Americans completely failed to understand was that they had witnessed one of the most catastrophic operational failures in airborne history. They never realized that a 1,200-man regiment had attempted to seize objectives behind their lines. They never understood that the scattered prisoners represented fragments of a much larger force, that the reason they saw no concentrated threat was because the force had never concentrated. American commanders continued planning and fighting based on intelligence assessments that missed Operation Stösser almost entirely. In their reports, the Battle of the Bulge was a massive German ground offensive supported by armor and artillery. Airborne operations were not mentioned because, from the American perspective, no significant airborne operation had occurred. The Germans had dropped some troops, those troops had been captured or had disappeared, and that was the end of it. This mutual incomprehension, German command not understanding how completely the operation had failed, American command not understanding that a major operation had been attempted at all, meant that Operation Stösser became historically invisible. It did not appear in German after-action reports as a significant failure because it was lost in the larger failure of the Battle of the Bulge. It did not appear in American after-action reports as a major threat because it had never coalesced into something recognizable as a threat. The operation existed in a strange historical limbo, too scattered to be visible, too failed to be studied, too embarrassing to be acknowledged. For years after the war, historians piecing together the Battle of the Bulge from archival documents would find only fragmentary references to Operation Stösser, confusing mentions of paratroopers without context or explanation. The operation had not just failed militarily, it had failed so completely that it had nearly failed to enter history at all. The invisibility extended even to the participants themselves. German soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge would meet each other in prison camps and discover they had been part of the same operation without knowing it. A paratrooper captured near Eupen would meet another captured near Malmedy, and they would compare stories and only then realize they had jumped from the same formation but landed 20 kilometers apart. They would try to understand what had happened, why the operation had scattered them so completely, whether anyone had reached the objective. The answers were fragmentary and unsatisfying. No one had reached Baraque Michel in strength. No one had established the blocking position. The operation had simply disintegrated in midair, and each of them had landed in his own private version of the mission, isolated and confused, and ultimately irrelevant to the larger battle raging around them. Post-war, when military historians began systematic studies of the Battle of the Bulge, Operation Stösser appeared as a minor footnote, if it appeared at all. The early histories, written in the late 1940s and early 1950s, barely mentioned it. American official histories gave it perhaps a paragraph, noting that German paratroopers had been dropped and captured, but attributing no significance to the operation. German histories were similarly dismissive, treating Stösser as an afterthought to the larger offensive. The operation that had consumed 1,200 lives and represented one of the most complete military failures of the war was being forgotten almost before it could be remembered, slipping through the cracks of history because it fit no convenient narrative and offered no clear lessons. It was only in the 1960s and 70s when researchers gained access to more complete German records and when surviving participants began sharing their stories publicly that Operation Stösser started to come into focus as a distinct and significant event. Historians found von der Heydte's interrogation transcripts and realized the operation had been much larger than previously understood. They found Luftwaffe flight logs documenting the chaotic drop. They interviewed survivors and reconstructed the scatter pattern, the failed assembly, the dissolution of the command. Slowly, painstakingly, the invisible failure became visible again. But decades had passed, and many witnesses were dead, and critical documents had been lost or destroyed. The full story would never be completely recoverable. Operation Stösser remained partially obscured, a ghost operation that historians could perceive only in fragments and shadows. The invisibility of the failure had consequences that extended beyond history. It meant that the lessons of Operation Stösser were not learned when they should have been learned. The catastrophic consequences of launching airborne operations without adequate preparation, without proper intelligence, without realistic assessment of capabilities, these lessons should have been obvious from Stösser. But because the operation was not properly documented or studied, because it became invisible even to the participants, those lessons were not extracted and applied. Future military planners would repeat similar mistakes, launching operations that ignored the constraints Stösser had brutally exposed, assuming that courage and determination could overcome inadequate preparation and unrealistic objectives. The invisible failure remained invisible to future decision-makers, and the pattern repeated in different wars, different conflicts, different contexts, but with the same fundamental error: believing that wanting success badly enough could make impossible operations possible. For the German High Command, the invisibility of Stösser's failure allowed them to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about their decision-making processes. If the operation had been properly analyzed, if its failure had been documented and studied, it would have revealed the bankruptcy of the strategic thinking that characterized Germany in late 1944. The magical thinking that assumed operations could succeed through willpower, despite lacking the resources, time, and realistic planning that success required. But because Stösser disappeared into the fog of the larger battle, because no one demanded a comprehensive accounting of what went wrong and why, the High Command never had to face what the operation said about them. They could blame the Luftwaffe or weather or bad luck without acknowledging that they had launched an operation they knew would fail, because acknowledging alternatives would have required acknowledging that Germany was losing the war beyond any hope of recovery. For the American forces who never fully understood what they had witnessed, the invisibility meant they drew the wrong conclusions about German capabilities. They had defeated a major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and they understandably focused on what they had seen: massed armor, determined infantry, aggressive tactics. They did not realize they had also defeated an airborne operation so thoroughly that it had ceased to exist before engaging them. The Americans' confidence in their air defenses, their intelligence capabilities, their ability to counter German operations, All of this was reinforced by victories in the Bulge, without them fully understanding that one of those victories had occurred almost by accident, that German incompetence rather than American competence had neutralized the airborne threat. It was a hollow victory, defeating an enemy who had already defeated himself, but it looked impressive in the reports and reinforced assumptions that would not be seriously questioned until later conflicts revealed their limitations. The invisible failure of Operation Stösser represented something beyond a single military disaster. It represented a systemic failure of command, intelligence, and institutional learning. An operation could be launched, could consume over 1,000 lives, could fail catastrophically, and yet leave so little trace that both sides barely noticed it had happened. The machinery of war had become so vast, so complex, so overwhelming, that individual operations could vanish into it like stones into an ocean, and if operations could become invisible, then so could the lessons they should have taught, the warnings they should have provided, the patterns they should have exposed. Operation Stösser failed not just tactically but historiographically, becoming the operation that almost wasn't, the battle that nearly disappeared, the warning that no one heard because no one realized it had been issued. Its invisibility was its final failure, ensuring that the mistakes that created it would be repeated, that other soldiers in other wars would be sent on impossible missions by commanders who had not learned because the lessons had been lost in the fog of a larger catastrophe. December 18th, 1944. Dawn, somewhere in the Ardennes forest. Oberfeldwebel Karl-Heinz Becker crouched behind a fallen log with 4 other paratroopers, watching an American supply convoy roll past on a road they needed to cross. The trucks moved slowly, grinding through snow in low gear, their canvas covers frosted white. The drivers looked cold and bored, never imagining that 5 German soldiers were hidden 50 meters away, desperate and armed, and trying not to cough or sneeze or make any sound that would reveal their presence. Becker had jumped 2 nights earlier, landed in trees, gathered these 4 men from the scattered drop, and been trying to reach German lines ever since. They had covered perhaps 8 kilometers in 36 hours, moving only at night, hiding during the day, avoiding all contact with American forces. They were lost, exhausted, and increasingly aware that the mission they had trained for was impossible. But they were alive, and Becker intended to keep them that way. The convoy finally passed, its engine noise fading into the forest. Becker counted to 100, then signaled his men forward. They crossed the road in a crouched run, 4 seconds of exposure, then back into the tree line on the far side. One of his men, a 19-year-old named Werner Schultz, stumbled and fell. Becker grabbed his arm and hauled him into cover, pressing a finger to his lips for silence. Schultz nodded, breathing hard, his face gray with cold and exhaustion. They had no way to make fires, no way to get warm except to keep moving. But movement during daylight meant exposure, and exposure meant capture or death. So they hid and froze and waited for darkness, trying to maintain body heat through stillness, when every instinct screamed to move, to run, to do anything but sit in the snow, slowly losing feeling in extremities. Becker's plan, such as it was, consisted of moving generally eastward, following terrain features that led away from obvious American positions, stealing food when they could, avoiding contact at all costs. He had a compass and a map, though the map was a standard military survey that showed terrain but not current positions of forces. He knew roughly where German lines should be, somewhere east of Monschau, but distances were deceptive in forest, and what looked like 3 kilometers on a map could be 10 kilometers of actual movement through snow and trees. His small group was armed: Mauser rifles, 1 MP-40 submachine gun, a couple of stick grenades. But they had perhaps 20 rounds per man, enough for one brief firefight, nowhere near enough to fight their way through American territory. Their weapons were for last resort only, for the desperate moment when capture or death were the only alternatives, and death at least offered the chance to take some enemies with them. That moment nearly came on December 19th. They were moving through a valley, trying to reach higher ground where they could observe terrain and determine their position when they walked into an American patrol. Both groups saw each other simultaneously, 30 meters apart, and for a frozen second no one moved. Then both sides dove for cover, and the forest erupted with rifle fire. Becker's training took over, issuing rapid commands, covering fire, movement by pairs, break contact and withdraw. They fired and moved, using every tactic they knew for disengagement. The Americans, apparently a rear area patrol not expecting contact, did not pursue aggressively. Within 2 minutes, Becker's group had put distance between themselves and the firefight, sprinting through snow and brush, putting trees between themselves and bullets. They ran for 10 minutes before Becker called a halt to check for casualties and count ammunition. One man had been grazed across the shoulder, nothing serious, but they had expended perhaps 50 rounds, a quarter of their total ammunition, for no gain except survival. They could not afford many more encounters like that. December 20th, evening. Approaching Moscow, Becker's group had been joined by 3 more stragglers, German paratroopers they had encountered hiding in a barn. Their group now numbered 8 men, too many for ideal stealth, but enough to provide security and share the burden of watches during rest periods. They were approximately 5 kilometers from what Becker believed was the forward edge of German-controlled territory near Moscow. So close, but those 5 kilometers might be the deadliest of the journey. The area was thick with American forces, supply lines feeding the defense against the German offensive. Every road was trafficked, every village occupied, every piece of open ground a potential killing zone. Becker decided they would try to infiltrate at night, using a stream bed for concealment, hoping to slip through the American positions and reach German lines before dawn. The infiltration began at 2200 hours. They moved single file, staying in the stream bed where winter ice muffled their footsteps, each man holding the equipment of the man in front of him to maintain contact in darkness. It was slow, agonizing movement, perhaps 200 meters per hour, every step deliberate, every sound potentially fatal. They passed within 100 meters of an American artillery position, hearing the crews talking as they serviced their guns, completely unaware that German soldiers were flowing past them like water. Becker's heart hammered so loudly he was certain the Americans would hear it. But they passed undetected, ghosts in the night, survivors of an operation that had scattered them but had not quite killed them yet. At 0300 hours on December 21st, they crossed into an area that felt different. The forest was empty of American voices, the night silent except for distant gunfire from the actual front lines. Becker risked moving to higher ground and saw, in the distance, what he thought might be German positions. A different pattern of foxholes, a different style of camouflage. He sent one man forward to make contact, waiting in agonizing silence for 15 minutes until the man returned with a German infantry Feldwebel who stared at them in amazement. Paratroopers? From where? Becker explained briefly. They had jumped 4 nights earlier, been scattered, spent the intervening time trying to reach safety. The Feldwebel shook his head in wonder and directed them to a command post a kilometer back where they could report and receive orders. Becker's group stumbled toward that command post, hardly believing they had made it, that the long walk was over, that they had survived. At the command post, an exhausted intelligence officer took their report and logged them as returned from Operation Stösser. He asked about von der Heydte, about other survivors, about whether they had accomplished any mission objectives. Becker told him everything: the scattered drop, the failed assembly, the dispersion that made the mission impossible. The intelligence officer listened with an expression that suggested he was hearing this story for the dozenth time from different survivors. He told Becker his group was one of several that had made it back, that perhaps 80 or 90 men total had reached German lines so far, that no one knew how many others were still out there or dead or captured. He assigned them to a rest area, told them to eat and sleep, said they would be reassigned to new units when they recovered. Becker and his men shuffled to the indicated barracks, collapsed on bunks, and slept the sleep of men who had walked through the valley of death and emerged, against odds, alive. But not all the long walks had happy endings. Hans Schmidt, a 22-year-old Gefreiter from Stuttgart, wandered alone through the Ardennes for 19 days after the drop. He had landed in a swamp, lost all his equipment except his rifle when he struggled out of the freezing water, and spent the next 2.5 weeks hiding and scavenging and slowly dying from cold and starvation. He ate bark and roots, and once, desperately, raw rabbit he managed to kill with a thrown stone. He slept in caves and hollow trees, and once in the cellar of a bombed house, always moving, always cold, always afraid. By early January, he was barely recognizable as human. His clothes were rags. His face was black with frostbite. He could no longer feel his feet, which had frozen weeks earlier and were now grotesque masses of necrotic tissue. He stumbled into a German outpost on January 3, 1945, more corpse than man, and collapsed. Medics who examined him immediately called for amputation equipment. Both feet would have to come off, possibly portions of both legs. Schmidt had survived the long walk only to lose the ability to walk at all. Not everyone made it even that far. In the spring of 1945, as the snow melted and Allied forces advanced through the Ardennes, they found bodies. German paratroopers, alone or in small groups, who had frozen to death in the forest or died of wounds or simply given up and stopped moving. Some were found in defensive positions they had apparently tried to hold, despite being hopelessly outnumbered and cut off. Others were found in caves or under rock overhangs, places where they had sought shelter and never emerged. The Americans buried them where they found them, marking graves with improvised crosses or helmet-topped rifles, trying to give some dignity to young men who had died alone in a foreign forest for reasons the Americans did not fully understand. One particularly haunting discovery came in 1950, 5 years after the war ended. Belgian farmers exploring caves in the Haute-Vienne region found the remains of 12 German soldiers, all wearing paratrooper insignia, all apparently having died during the winter of 1944 to 1945. The condition of the remains and the evidence in the cave suggested they had taken shelter together, possibly wounded, possibly lost, and had simply frozen to death over a period of days or weeks. They had arranged their equipment carefully, had made attempts to build fires with wet wood that never properly ignited, had written letters that were found with the bodies. The letters spoke of hope that they would be rescued, confidence that German forces would soon overrun the area, instructions for families about personal possessions. The letters were dated late December 1944. The 12 men had been there all through the war's end, all through the occupation, all through 5 years of peace, waiting to be found. Their families had mourned them as missing, not knowing that they lay in a cave barely 10 kilometers from a major road, invisible to the living world, casualties of an operation that had scattered them so completely that they had disappeared into the landscape itself. The psychological toll of the long walk was as devastating as the physical toll. Men who survived the journey to German lines arrived broken in ways that had nothing to do with their bodies. They had spent days or weeks in constant fear, never secure, never safe, watching comrades die or disappear, operating on the edge of survival. Post-war interviews with survivors reveal recurring patterns. Nightmares about being hunted, about being lost, about being frozen. Some survivors refused to go into forests for the rest of their lives, traumatized by the Ardennes experience. Others became hyper-vigilant, unable to relax, always scanning for threats. The long walk had rewired their nervous systems, turning them into permanent survivors of an experience that never quite ended even after they reached safety. There were moments of unexpected humanity during those desperate weeks. Several survivors reported being helped by Belgian civilians who, at enormous risk to themselves, provided food or shelter or simply did not betray German soldiers hiding in their barns. These acts of compassion were rare. Most civilians were terrified of reprisals from either side and wanted nothing to do with armed men. But they occurred, small lights in the darkness. One paratrooper, Werner Goldbach, later recounted being hidden by an elderly Belgian couple for 3 days while American patrols searched the area. The couple spoke no German, he spoke no French, but they communicated through gestures and shared humanity. They fed him soup and bread, gave him dry clothes, and pointed him toward what they believed were German positions when he left. Goldbach survived the war and returned to Belgium in the 1960s to try to find them and thank them. He never located the farmhouse or learned their names. They had saved his life and disappeared back into anonymity, ordinary people who had made an extraordinary choice to help an enemy soldier because it was the human thing to do. Other encounters were less benign. At least 4 German paratroopers were killed by Belgian resistance fighters who found them hiding in rural areas. The resistance, emboldened by German retreat and Allied advance, was settling scores and eliminating German stragglers. The paratroopers, lost and confused and often unarmed after abandoning equipment, made easy targets. Their bodies were found later, often with signs of execution rather than combat. Single shots to the head, hands bound, evidence of interrogation. The Americans who investigated these deaths filed reports noting the executions, but took no action. By early 1945, the war's brutality had desensitized everyone, and the death of a few German soldiers at the hands of partisans seemed insignificant compared to the larger carnage. Friendly fire claimed more lives during the long walk than direct combat with American forces. German units, paranoid about American infiltrators and special operations troops, fired on anything moving in no man's land. At least 15 Stösser paratroopers were killed by German forces who mistook them for enemies. The paratroopers, trying to identify themselves, would call out recognition codes in German, only to be shot by frightened sentries who assumed any voice in the darkness was a trick. Other paratroopers, wearing mixed German and captured American equipment after scavenging supplies, looked enough like Americans in the confusion of winter warfare that German troops engaged them without question. These deaths were particularly bitter for survivors who learned about them. They had survived the drop, survived the cold, survived American patrols, only to be killed by their own side within meters of safety. December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve. 8 paratroopers hiding in a Belgian farmer's barn heard American voices outside, then the barn door being forced open. They had been there for 2 days, eating feed corn intended for livestock, trying to decide whether to attempt reaching German lines or surrender. The decision was made for them. The American patrol, infantry from the 1st Infantry Division, experienced and alert, entered with weapons ready, searching the barn systematically. The Germans tried to hide in the hayloft, but the Americans had done this before, knew all the hiding places, prodded the hay with bayonets until they found human flesh. Shouts, confusion, Germans trying to surrender, Americans trying to secure prisoners, and then somehow shooting started. Perhaps one German panicked and reached for a weapon. Perhaps one American misinterpreted a gesture. Whatever the reason, the barn exploded into gunfire at point-blank range. When it ended, 3 Germans and 2 Americans were dead. The surviving Germans were dragged from the barn, beaten by enraged American soldiers who had just lost comrades, then secured and evacuated. The incident was logged as a combat action, justifiable self-defense, though witnesses would later disagree about who had fired first and whether the Germans had actually posed a threat. It was Christmas Eve, 1944, and men died in a Belgian barn over a misunderstanding in a battle that was already lost, in an operation that had failed a week earlier. The survivor who later recounted this story spoke of it with grinding fatigue, not anger, not even sadness, just exhaustion at the senselessness, the randomness, the fact that you could survive a catastrophic airborne operation only to die in a barn because someone misread someone else's intentions. War was like that, he said. It killed you whenever it felt like it, and reasons were luxuries the dead did not need. January 3rd, 1945. Hans Schmidt, the paratrooper with the frozen feet, underwent bilateral amputation at a German field hospital. The surgeon, overworked and operating without adequate anesthesia, removed both legs below the knee in a procedure that lasted 40 minutes and felt like eternity. Schmidt survived the operation, but would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, the youngest double amputee in his village, explaining to anyone who asked that he had lost his legs in an airborne operation that most people had never heard of. His story was typical of those who survived the long walk with severe injuries. Lives permanently altered, bodies permanently damaged, futures permanently constrained by decisions made in headquarters far away by commanders who never faced the consequences of their orders. The mental accounting of survival was complex and varied by individual. Some survivors felt guilty that they had lived when others died. They questioned whether they could have done more to help fallen comrades, whether their survival was earned or simply lucky, whether they deserved to go home when so many did not. Other survivors felt angry, bitter that they had been sent on an impossible mission, that their suffering had served no strategic purpose, that they had been abandoned by the command structure that was supposed to support them. A few survivors felt nothing, emotionally numb, unable to process what had happened to them. They functioned mechanically, followed orders, returned to their units, but something essential had broken inside them during the long walk. They would carry that brokenness for the rest of their lives, a wound invisible to others but always present, always aching. The final survivor reached German lines on January 22, 1945, 37 days after the initial jump. He was a Feldwebel named Otto Heinrichs, and his story was almost unbelievable. He had landed far from any other paratroopers, injured his leg in the landing, and been unable to move quickly. He had hidden during the day and foraged at night, stealing from American supply dumps, scavenging equipment from dead soldiers, living like an animal in the forest. He had crossed back and forth through the lines multiple times as the front shifted during the Battle of the Bulge, sometimes behind American positions, sometimes in no man's land, once actually in a German-held village without realizing it until he saw the markings on vehicles. He had lost over 20 kilograms, suffered from severe malnutrition and multiple infections, and was barely coherent when German soldiers found him wandering near Prüm. His interrogation produced a rambling account of 37 days in the Ardennes, details that intelligence officers struggled to verify or understand. He claimed to have seen other German paratroopers on several occasions, but had been unable to make contact. He reported American positions and strengths, though by late January most of this intelligence was obsolete, the Americans having advanced far beyond the positions Heinrichs described. He asked repeatedly about von der Heydte and the rest of the Kampfgruppe, wanting to know if the mission had succeeded, if anyone had reached Baraque Michel, if his long survival had served any purpose. The intelligence officers told him the truth. The mission had failed. Most of the Kampfgruppe was dead or captured. The Battle of the Bulge had been a German defeat. Heinrichs received this information without visible emotion, then asked if he could eat something and sleep. He was sent to a hospital and never returned to combat duty. The war ended 3 months later, and Heinrichs went home to discover his family had believed him dead, had held a memorial service in January when no word of his survival reached them. He attended his own memorial gathering, surprising relatives who thought they were seeing a ghost, unable to explain where he had been or how he had survived. The long walk back represented different things to different men. For some, it was a test they had passed, proof of their competence and resilience. For others, it was a nightmare that never quite ended, a trauma that shadowed their remaining years. For a few, it was simply an experience that defied explanation, something that had happened to them that they could neither justify nor understand. But for all of them, it was the crucible that transformed Operation Stösser from a military action into a personal ordeal. The mission had failed in the first hours. Everything that came after was not war, but survival. Not tactics, but desperation. Not glory, but grinding determination to stay alive one more day, one more night, one more kilometer. The long walk was where the operation truly ended, not in captured crossroads or brilliant victories, but in frozen forests and hidden caves and desperate sprints toward safety. It was where the paratroopers of Kampfgruppe von der Heydte stopped being soldiers and became survivors, where they lost whatever illusions they had about war's nobility and learned that survival is its own victory, small and private and overlooked by history, but infinitely valuable to the men who achieve it. Post-war reunions of Stösser survivors were somber affairs, men gathering to remember comrades who had not made it back, to share stories they had told no one else, to find community with the only other people who truly understood what they had experienced. These reunions grew smaller each year as age and illness claimed the survivors, until by the 1990s, only a handful remained. They would meet in German beer halls or village community centers, old men with canes and wheelchairs and memories, speaking of that winter when they had jumped into darkness and scattered like leaves, when they had walked through enemy territory trying to reach home, when they had learned that war was not adventure or glory, but cold and fear and the desperate animal need to survive. They spoke of the long walk with a mixture of pride and sadness, proud that they had endured, sad for those who had not, and they asked the question that had haunted them for decades. Why? Why had they been sent? Why had the mission been launched when everyone involved knew it would fail? Why had 1,200 lives been spent for no strategic gain, no tactical advantage, no meaningful purpose? The answers never satisfied them because the truth was unsatisfying. They had been sent because the machinery of war, once started, was difficult to stop, because commanders made decisions based on maps and theories rather than human limitations, because acknowledging that an operation was impossible required acknowledging larger failures that military institutions refused to confront. The survivors of the long walk had learned these truths through experience, had paid for that education with frostbitten limbs and dead friends and years of nightmares. They carried that knowledge like a burden, wanting to share it, wanting others to understand so the mistakes would not be repeated. But history moved on. New wars came with new mistakes, and the lessons of Operation Stösser remained largely unlearned. The survivors died, one by one, taking their stories with them, until only written accounts remained. Testimony from men who had walked the long way back from a failed operation and lived to tell about it. Warnings from the past that the future seemed determined to ignore. December 26, 1944. Luftwaffe Headquarters, Berlin. The inquiry convened at 0900 hours in a conference room heated inadequately against winter cold. 3 Luftwaffe colonels sat behind a table covered with documents, flight logs, pilot reports, weather summaries, communications transcripts. Across from them sat a succession of Junkers 52 pilots, each called individually to explain his role in Operation Stösser and why the mission had failed so catastrophically. The pilots were tired and defensive, men who had flown a dangerous mission and returned alive, only to be told they were now under investigation for incompetence. The lead investigator, Oberst Heinrich Müller, opened the proceedings with a speech about the importance of determining what had gone wrong, so lessons could be applied to future operations. The pilots listened with expressionless faces, understanding that this inquiry was not about learning lessons. It was about assigning blame, finding scapegoats, protecting senior commanders from responsibility for a disaster that had been predictable from the planning stages. The first pilot questioned was Hauptmann Kurt Fischer, who had flown the Pathfinder aircraft, responsible for leading the formation to the drop zone. Fischer described the flight in precise detail: the takeoff, the formation assembly, the navigation across Germany toward Belgium. He explained that his aircraft had been equipped with the best available navigation equipment, that his crew had trained for this mission as much as the compressed timeline allowed, that they had followed proper procedures throughout. But when they reached the Rhine River crossing, heavy cloud cover had obscured landmarks. American anti-aircraft fire had forced evasive maneuvers. The formation had scattered. Fischer had continued toward what he believed was the target area, but without visual confirmation of landmarks, he could not guarantee his accuracy. He had dropped his paratroopers where his navigation calculations placed Baraque Michel. Whether that location was correct, he could not say with certainty. Oberst Mueller asked why Fisher had not aborted the mission when navigation became uncertain. Fisher looked at him with barely concealed contempt. Abort? On whose authority? His orders had been explicit. Reach the drop zone, deliver the paratroopers, return to base. There had been no provision for aborting if conditions deteriorated. Mueller pressed the point. Surely a skilled pilot would recognize when a mission had become unviable and make the professional judgment to abort rather than drop men in wrong locations. Fisher's response was quiet but cutting. He was a military pilot following military orders. The decision to launch the operation despite inadequate preparation, insufficient training time, and weather uncertainties was not his decision. He had executed his orders to the best of his ability under circumstances that were impossible from the start. If Oberst Mueller wanted to find fault, perhaps he should investigate whoever had authorized launching a mass formation night drop with pilots who had minimal night flying experience and no rehearsal time. The room went silent. Fisher had violated the unspoken rule of military inquiries. Blame was supposed to flow downward, from commanders to subordinates, not upward toward the decision-makers. Mueller's face flushed, and he warned Fisher about insubordination. But Fisher was beyond caring. He had flown through American anti-aircraft fire, navigated in impossible conditions, returned his aircraft and crew safely, and was now being interrogated as if the mission's failure was his personal responsibility. He told Mueller that 12 other pilots waited outside, and they would all tell the same story. The operation had been doomed by inadequate planning, not pilot error. If the Luftwaffe wanted scapegoats, they would have to arrest everyone involved, including the senior officers who had signed off on the mission parameters. Mueller dismissed Fisher and called a recess. The inquiry was not proceeding as planned. Over the next 3 days, the Luftwaffe interrogated pilots, navigators, and crew chiefs, compiling testimony that painted a consistent picture. The operation had suffered from every possible planning failure. Transport pilots had been given insufficient time to train for night formation flying. Navigation equipment was inadequate for the precision required. Weather briefings had understated the extent of cloud cover and wind conditions. The anti-aircraft threat had been minimized in pre-mission briefings. Radio silence protocols prevented coordination when the formation scattered. Drop zone selection had been based on map study rather than aerial reconnaissance. And underlying everything was the reality that the Luftwaffe in December 1944 simply lacked the resources, the trained pilots, the properly maintained aircraft, the fuel, the time, to execute a complex airborne operation successfully. The pilots had done their best with inadequate tools. The failure was systemic, not individual. But the inquiry could not say that. To acknowledge systemic failure would require acknowledging that Germany's military position was hopeless, that operations were being launched out of desperation rather than capability, that the High Command was ordering missions it knew would fail because admitting they could not be accomplished would mean admitting the war was lost. So the inquiry's conclusions, released in mid-January 1945, distributed blame carefully and politically. Weather was cited as a primary factor, an act of God, no one's fault. Pilot inexperience was mentioned, but framed as unfortunate timing rather than predictable consequence of launching the operation with insufficient training. American anti-aircraft fire was noted as heavier than expected, enemy action unpredictable. The report contained recommendations for future airborne operations, more training time, better navigation equipment, improved weather forecasting, Pathfinder teams with better marking equipment. These recommendations were reasonable and useless because Germany would never launch another major airborne operation, but they allowed the inquiry to conclude with suggestions for improvement rather than acknowledgement of fundamental failure. 12 pilots were charged with various degrees of dereliction of duty, accused of navigational errors that contributed to the scattered drop. 8 were eventually acquitted when it became clear that prosecuting them would require examining the orders they had received and the conditions under which they had operated, examinations that would implicate senior officers. 4 were quietly reassigned to non-combat positions, neither punished nor exonerated, simply removed from situations where their testimony might prove embarrassing. The inquiry ended without anyone in the command structure accepting responsibility for the disaster. The Operation Stösser had been nobody's fault, a confluence of bad luck and adverse circumstances, a mission that would have succeeded if only weather and pilots and fortune had cooperated. It was a comfortable lie that allowed everyone involved to avoid difficult truths. January 1945. Generaloberst, Kurt, Students' Headquarters, Netherlands. Student was preparing his own defense, drafting memoranda that would protect his reputation in the inevitable post-war accounting. He had commanded German airborne forces since their inception, had planned the spectacular assaults on Holland and Crete, had been revered as an innovator and tactician. He was not going to allow Operation Stösser to tarnish that legacy. His explanation was straightforward. The operation had been tactically sound, carefully planned within the constraints provided, and would have succeeded if the Luftwaffe had executed properly. The failure was not in the conception, but in the execution. Not in students' planning, but in the incompetence of transport pilots and the bad luck of weather. He compiled supporting documentation, his orders to von der Heydte, which showed clear objectives and reasonable timelines. His requests for resources, which showed he had asked for more training time and been denied. His operational concept, which showed a solid understanding of airborne tactics. What the documents did not show was students' role in approving an operation he knew was under-resourced and over-optimistic, his failure to push back harder against impossible timelines, his willingness to sacrifice 1,200 men on a low-probability mission because refusing would have required confronting uncomfortable realities about Germany's capabilities. Students' memoranda portrayed Operation Stösser as a calculated risk that happened not to pay off, rather than a predictable disaster that never should have been launched. He emphasized the operation's potential strategic value. Blocking American reinforcements could have allowed 6th SS Panzer Army to reach its objectives, possibly changing the course of the Battle of the Bulge. He downplayed the evidence that the operation was impossible from the start, that the timeline was unrealistic, that the resources were inadequate. And he subtly shifted responsibility to others, the Luftwaffe for poor execution, Hitler for insisting on aggressive timelines, von der Heydte for failing to achieve objectives despite difficult circumstances. It was a masterful piece of bureaucratic self-preservation, reframing failure as honorable attempt, transforming predictable disaster into unfortunate coincidence. Von der Heydte, captured and interrogated by Americans, provided a very different account. He held nothing back, describing the operation's flaws in brutal detail, documenting his protests, explaining exactly why the mission had been impossible from the beginning. His interrogation transcripts, running to hundreds of pages, painted a picture of criminal negligence at the highest levels of German command, launching an operation without adequate resources, ignoring expert objections, proceeding on schedule despite every indicator pointing toward disaster. Von der Heydte did not blame his men or the Luftwaffe pilots. He blamed the system that had ordered the operation, the commanders who had approved it, the military culture that valued obedience over judgment and attack over realistic assessment. His testimony was devastating because it was specific, documented, and came from someone with unquestionable credentials. Von der Heydte was a decorated hero, a professional soldier, a man whose criticisms could not be dismissed as cowardice or defeatism. When he said the operation was doomed, he was not making excuses. He was stating facts. The Americans found his testimony fascinating, but struggled with what to do with it. Operation Stösser was a minor footnote in the larger Battle of the Bulge, interesting as a case study, but not strategically significant. They filed von der Heydte's testimony in intelligence archives and moved on to more pressing matters. But the testimony would resurface years later, becoming the primary source for historians trying to understand what had happened. Von der Heydte's willingness to speak honestly, to assign responsibility clearly, to explain both his actions and the systemic failures that had created the disaster, made his account invaluable. It also made him unpopular with former comrades who preferred students' version, the story of a good plan foiled by bad luck, rather than a bad plan that produced predictable results. April 1946, Nuremberg, Germany. The major war crimes trials were winding down, but smaller tribunals were still examining specific cases of military malfeasance. Operation Stösser came up during investigations into whether German military leaders had criminally misused their forces, sending soldiers on suicidal missions without adequate preparation or support. The prosecutors examined von der Heydte's testimony, reviewed the planning documents, interviewed survivors. They concluded that while the operation had been incompetently planned and executed, it did not rise to the level of criminal conduct. Incompetence was not a war crime. Commanders made mistakes in every war. The fact that German High Command had launched an operation that failed did not mean they had committed crimes, at least not crimes prosecutable under international law. The investigation was closed without charges, though the examining judge added a note to the file. The operation represented a case study in how desperation and institutional pressure could lead professional military officers to make decisions they knew were wrong. Sacrificing subordinates' lives for objectives they privately acknowledged were unachievable. Future military organizations should study Operation Stösser as a warning about what happens when strategic fantasy overwhelms operational reality. That recommendation was filed away and forgotten, like so much wisdom generated by post-war analysis. The armies that emerged from World War II were interested in learning lessons about tactics and technology, not uncomfortable lessons about command responsibility and institutional failure. Operation Stösser was studied briefly, if at all, and the lessons it should have taught went largely unlearned. Subsequent decades would see other operations launched with inadequate preparation, other soldiers sent on impossible missions, other commanders prioritizing orders over judgment because the institutional culture rewarded obedience more than wisdom. The bureaucracy of failure that had created Operation Stösser persisted, adapting to new contexts but maintaining the same fundamental patterns. Pressure from above, optimism overriding evidence, blame flowing downward when things went wrong. 1947 to 1948. The memoir Wars. Student published his memoirs, devoting several chapters to airborne operations and barely mentioning Operation Stösser. When he did discuss it, he framed it as one of many operations conducted under difficult circumstances during Germany's final defensive efforts. He neither accepted responsibility nor blamed others directly, simply presented it as an unfortunate attempt that circumstances had thwarted. Von der Heydte, released from prisoner of war status and returning to civilian life, read Student's account and was furious. He wrote letters to Student and to publishers, disputing the characterization, providing documentation of his protests and warnings. Student never responded directly, but his associates spread the word that von der Heydte was bitter about his own failure and was trying to shift blame to superiors. The disagreement never became public warfare. Both men were too professional for that, but it poisoned their relationship and created competing narratives about Operation Stösser that would persist for decades. Historians who later tried to adjudicate between these narratives generally sided with von der Heydte. The documentary evidence supported his version. The timeline had been impossible, the resources inadequate, the warnings ignored. Students' defense, that the operation would have worked with better execution, required believing that competent execution could overcome inadequate preparation, insufficient training, and unrealistic objectives. Few historians accepted that premise. But Student's reputation as the father of German airborne forces meant his version retained influence, especially among military professionals who were uncomfortable with von der Heydte's implications about command responsibility. If von der Heydte was right, if commanders were responsible for refusing impossible orders rather than executing them incompetently, that raised uncomfortable questions about military obedience and the limits of subordinate responsibility. It was easier to blame execution than planning, easier to fault pilots and weather than to examine the decisions that had created the disaster in the first place. The bureaucracy of failure protected itself, as bureaucracies always do, by diffusing responsibility until no one was accountable, by generating reports that explained everything while changing nothing, by treating predictable disasters as unforeseeable circumstances. The pilots who had flown the mission were blamed, then quietly exonerated, their careers damaged regardless. Von der Heydte, who had documented his objections and tried to save lives, was viewed with suspicion by former comrades who felt he had betrayed professional solidarity by speaking too honestly. Student, who had approved the operation despite its obvious flaws, maintained his reputation as a brilliant tactician undone by subordinate failures. And the 1,200 men who had jumped into darkness and scattered across the Ardennes were forgotten, their sacrifice serving no strategic purpose, their deaths teaching no lessons, their stories buried in archives, until historians stumbled across them decades later and tried to reconstruct what had happened and why. The blame and bureaucracy surrounding Operation Stösser's failure revealed something essential about military institutions. They are structurally incapable of learning certain lessons because learning those lessons would require acknowledging truths that threaten institutional stability. The lesson of Stösser, that operations should not be launched when commanders know they will fail, that institutional pressure is not justification for sending soldiers to die, that command responsibility includes refusing orders, not just executing them, was a lesson military bureaucracies could not integrate without transforming their fundamental nature. So the lesson went unlearned, documented but not internalized, recorded but not applied, preserved in archives where it gathered dust, while new generations of commanders repeated the same mistakes in different contexts with different soldiers who died just as completely as the paratroopers of Operation Stösser, killed by institutions that valued process over outcome, obedience over judgment, and the appearance of decisive action over the reality of thoughtful restraint. The bureaucracy processed the failure, generated reports, assigned blame judiciously, and moved on. The dead stayed dead, the lessons stayed unlearned, and the machinery ground forward, ready to consume the next group of soldiers who would be asked to attempt the impossible and blamed when they inevitably failed. May 1952. Baraque, Michel crossroads, Belgium. A small crowd gathered on a spring morning, perhaps 50 people, mostly Belgian civilians with a handful of former German soldiers among them. They had come for the dedication of a memorial, a simple stone marker placed at the crossroads that German paratroopers had been ordered to seize in December 1944. The marker bore inscriptions in French, Flemish, and German, commemorating the soldiers of all nations who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. It did not mention Operation Stösser specifically. Few of the Belgian civilians even knew about the failed airborne operation. But for the German veterans present, the memorial had specific meaning. This was the objective they had never reached, the crossroads that 1,200 men had jumped to seize and that perhaps 24 had actually approached. Standing here, looking at terrain they had tried to cross 8 years earlier, the veterans felt the strangeness of survival, the arbitrary fortune that had let them live when so many had died. Among those present was Friedrich von der Heydte, walking with a pronounced limp, looking older than his 55 years. He had come despite reservations, unsure what purpose this memorial served, uncertain whether public commemoration helped or hurt. He had spent the post-war years trying to move past his military service, focusing on legal scholarship and teaching, avoiding veteran reunions and military ceremonies. But something about this memorial had drawn him back, perhaps the need to see the crossroads, to stand on the ground where his men had been ordered to go, to physically inhabit the objective that had cost so many lives. A Belgian priest conducted a brief service, offering prayers for the dead of all nations. Then the mayor of the local commune gave a short speech about reconciliation, about transforming battlefields into places of peace, about remembering the past without being trapped by it. Von der Heydte was invited to speak representing the German veterans. He had prepared brief remarks, professional and appropriate, thanking the Belgians for their generosity in commemorating former enemies. But standing at the memorial, looking at the faces of the other veterans, He set aside his prepared text and spoke from the heart. He talked about the operation, about the 1,200 men who had jumped, about those who had died trying to reach this crossroads. He spoke about command responsibility, about the weight of ordering men into situations you know are impossible, about the choices commanders face when following orders means sacrificing lives. It was not a typical memorial speech. It was too honest, too raw, too willing to assign blame, including to himself. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded, recognizing truth even when it was unwelcome. Von der Heydte concluded by saying that the memorial was less for the dead, who were beyond caring, than for the living, who needed reminders that some military operations should never be launched, that courage and obedience are not always virtues, that the greatest honor a commander can show his men is sometimes refusing to lead them into disaster. The speech created awkward silence, then scattered applause. Von der Heydte stepped back from the memorial, his duty fulfilled, and was approached by several former paratroopers who gripped his hand and thanked him for his honesty. One veteran, a man who had made it back to German lines in January 1945, told von der Heydte that releasing the men that December night had saved his life, that he had always wanted to thank him for that decision. Von der Heydte accepted the thanks with visible discomfort, still ambivalent about a choice that had violated every principle of his military training. But he was also grateful for the acknowledgement, for confirmation that his decision had not been pure cowardice or abandonment, but something more complicated, a choice that prioritized human survival over institutional expectations, that valued individual lives over collective glory, that recognized when a mission had become an execution and refused to participate further in the killing. The memorial dedication was covered briefly in Belgian newspapers and ignored entirely in German press. It was a minor event, a small marker for a small battle in a war that was being processed and reprocessed by historians and memoirists. But for the Stösser survivors who attended, it represented something important, official recognition that their operation had occurred, that they had not simply imagined their participation in a mission that history had largely forgotten. The memorial said, in stone and bronze, that they had been here, that they had fought and suffered, and some had died, that their experience mattered even if the operation had failed. It was a small victory against the invisibility that had threatened to erase Operation Stösser entirely from the historical record. 1960s and 70s. The reunion years. Survivors of Operation Stösser began organizing annual gatherings, meeting to remember comrades and share stories. The first reunions were well attended, 50 or 60 men, but attendance declined as years passed and age took its toll. By the 1970s, only 20 or 30 survivors regularly attended. They were old men now, grandfathers mostly, their military service a distant memory. But the reunions served a purpose beyond nostalgia. They were the only place where these men could speak honestly about their experiences, where they did not have to explain or justify or defend. Everyone present understood what it meant to have jumped into darkness and landed alone, to have wandered through enemy territory, to have survived through luck more than skill. They understood the guilt of survival, the memories that did not fade, the anger at having been used as expendable resources in an operation that should never have occurred. The reunions were somber affairs, heavy drinking and quiet conversations, occasional laughter, but more often silence. They visited battlefields and cemeteries, paying respects to those who had not returned. They compared notes about what happened after the war, who had found work, who had struggled, whose wounds still caused pain, whose families had welcomed them home, and whose had been broken by war. They discovered that many of them carried similar scars, not just physical injuries, but psychological damage from those days in the forest. Nightmares about being hunted, anxiety in wooded areas, difficulty with authority figures after years of following orders that led to disaster. They did not discuss these things explicitly. German men of their generation did not talk openly about mental health, but they recognized the symptoms in each other and felt less alone for it. Von der Heydte attended several early reunions, but eventually stopped coming. His presence made some survivors uncomfortable, reminding them of command failures and impossible decisions. He had become a symbol, which meant he was no longer quite human, and the reunions worked better when participants were just veterans, just men without rank or responsibility clouding interactions. Von der Heydte understood and did not push. He had made his peace, such as it was, with Operation Stösser. He did not need annual reminders of his failures and his choices. He lived with those memories every day, particularly in winter when cold weather made his damaged ankle ache, and he remembered the frozen forest where he had made the hardest decision of his life. December 1979, Würzburg, Germany. Friedrich von der Heydte died at age 82, his body finally giving out after years of declining health. His obituary in German newspapers mentioned his service as a paratrooper commander, his post-war career as a law professor, his role in establishing the Bundeswehr Reserve Program. Operation Stösser was mentioned in one sentence, participated in the December 1944 airborne operation during the Ardennes offensive. Most readers would have skipped past that reference without recognition, but the handful of Stösser survivors who read the obituary understood immediately. Von der Heydte, the man who had tried to save them by releasing them, the commander who had prioritized their lives over his career, was gone. His death felt like the end of something, a chapter closing, the beginning of the end of living memory of the operation. A group of survivors attended von der Heydte's funeral, older men in dark suits, standing in the back of the church, paying respects to a commander they had complex feelings about. After the service, they gathered briefly, trading memories. One man recalled von der Heydte's speech before the jump, the honesty about the mission's dangers. Another remembered seeing him in the forest, injured and exhausted but still trying to lead. A third spoke of learning years later about von der Heydte's written protests before the operation, his attempts to stop it before it began. They had not always agreed with his decisions. Some still felt he should have held the force together longer, should have tried harder to accomplish the mission. But they respected him for trying to save lives when he could have simply followed orders and sent them to die for military tradition's sake. That respect was grudging in some cases, wholehearted in others, but it was universal. Von der Heydte had made mistakes, but he had also made the crucial choice to value his men over his mission. In the end, that choice defined him more than any tactical decision or operational failure. 1980s and 90s, fading memory and military lessons. The Bundeswehr, Germany's post-war military, began using Operation Stösser as a case study in military ethics courses. The operation provided clear examples of what not to do, launching missions without adequate preparation, ignoring expert objections, prioritizing schedule over capability. But the Bundeswehr courses also examined von der Heydte's decision to dissolve his command, presenting it as a dilemma about the limits of obedience. When do a commander's obligations to his men outweigh his obligations to follow orders? At what point does executing an impossible mission cross from duty into criminality? The Bundeswehr instructors presented these questions without providing definitive answers, allowing officer candidates to wrestle with the ethical complexities. Some students argued that von der Heydte had abandoned his responsibility, that a commander's duty was to attempt the mission regardless of odds. Others argued he had shown moral courage by refusing to waste lives for symbolic purposes, that the highest duty was to preserve soldiers' lives when operational success had become impossible. The debates were vigorous and revealing, exposing the tension between military tradition and human morality that Operation Stösser had crystallized so starkly. The Bundeswehr case studies served another purpose. They reminded a new generation of German officers that their predecessors had made catastrophic mistakes, that following orders was not sufficient justification for professional conduct, that individual judgment remained essential even in hierarchical military structures. This was particularly important for the Bundeswehr, which was consciously trying to build a military culture different from the Wehrmacht's, one that emphasized individual responsibility over blind obedience. Operation Stösser became a cautionary tale about what happened when obedience trumped judgment, when institutional pressure overrode professional assessment, when commanders valued their careers more than their soldiers' lives. The case study was uncomfortable precisely because it was effective, forcing officers to confront scenarios where right action conflicted with proper orders. By the 1990s, the annual Stösser survivor reunions had dwindled to a handful of men, barely enough to justify gathering. They met in small German towns, 8 or 10 veterans in their 70s and 80s, reminiscing about an operation most of the world had forgotten. They discussed practical matters: who had died in the past year, whose health was failing, whether they should continue the reunions or acknowledge that time had won. They decided to keep meeting as long as anyone remained, even if only 2 or 3 survivors attended. The reunions had become ritual, a way of honoring the dead and acknowledging the bond that men who shared impossible experiences carried for life. As long as one survivor lived, the reunions would continue, a commitment to memory in an era that increasingly forgot World War II's smaller stories in favor of its grand narratives. 2004. Altenau, Germany. The German military established a memorial at the training center where Kampfgruppe von der Heydte had assembled in December 1944. The memorial consisted of a plaque mounted on stone, listing the names of confirmed Stösser casualties, 157 names inscribed in bronze. The inscription above the names read, "In memory of the Paratroopers of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 who jumped into darkness on December 17, 1944. Soldiers betrayed by leadership, who nevertheless maintained honor in impossible circumstances." The wording had been controversial during planning, particularly the phrase "betrayed by leadership." Some retired officers argued it was inappropriate to criticize command decisions on a memorial, but the committee responsible for the memorial, which included several Stösser survivors, insisted on honesty. These men had been betrayed, sent on a mission their commanders knew would fail, abandoned without support, left to die or be captured because institutional priorities valued offensive action over operational reality. The memorial would not sugarcoat that truth. The dedication ceremony was attended by Bundeswehr officers, local civilians, and 3 surviving Stösser veterans, the last men alive who had made the jump in December 1944. They were in their 80s now, frail but determined to witness this final recognition. One of them, Otto Heinrichs, the same Heinrichs who had survived 37 days in the Ardennes, spoke briefly. He said the memorial was not about glorifying war or military service. It was about remembering that soldiers deserve leadership worthy of their courage, that sending men to die for unachievable objectives was not tactics but murder, that the greatest memorial anyone could offer the dead of Operation Stösser was ensuring such operations never happened again. He concluded by reading the names of specific men he had known. Werner Schultz, who had frozen to death 3 days after the jump. Anton Schreiber, found hanging from his parachute in a tree. Klaus Fischer, killed by friendly fire while trying to reach German lines. 23 names, men Heinrichs had jumped with or met in the forest or heard about from other survivors. He read each name slowly, giving them presence, making them real for the audience of strangers who had never known them as anything but statistics. After the ceremony, Heinrichs was interviewed by a German military journalist researching Operation Stösser for a historical article. The journalist asked if Heinrichs held bitterness about his service, about the operation that had nearly killed him. Heinrichs thought carefully before answering. He said he was not bitter toward Germany or the military as institutions. He had volunteered for paratrooper service, had believed in defending his country, had done his duty as he understood it, but he was bitter about the commanders who had launched Operation Stösser knowing it would fail, who had documented its impossibility in writing and proceeded anyway, who had valued their careers and the appearance of aggressive action over the lives of 1,200 men. That bitterness had not faded with time. It had crystallized, becoming a permanent part of his understanding of war and command and institutional responsibility. He hoped the memorial would ensure future generations remembered that military valor was hollow without military wisdom, that courage in soldiers required wisdom in commanders, that the dead of Operation Stösser deserved to be remembered not as heroes who fell gloriously, but as victims of institutional failure who died unnecessarily. 2000 through 2010. Archaeological discoveries. As the 60th and 70th anniversaries of the Battle of the Bulge approached, renewed interest in the campaign sparked archaeological surveys of lesser-known battle sites. Teams of researchers and metal detector enthusiasts explored the Ardennes and Haute-Vienne regions, looking for artifacts and evidence of forgotten engagements. They found more than expected: scattered German equipment across a 25-kilometer radius, exactly matching the documented dispersion of Operation Stösser. Parachute fragments still hung in trees. Weapons were discovered in caves and under rock ledges where paratroopers had hidden them. Personal items emerged from the forest floor: letters, identification tags, photos, the inanimate debris of men who had passed through and not returned. The most significant discovery came in 2007, when a survey team explored caves in the Haute-Vienne region and found human remains. DNA analysis eventually identified 8 individuals, all German soldiers, all belonging to Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6. The remains and surrounding evidence suggested these men had taken shelter together, probably wounded or exhausted, and had died during the winter of 1944 to 45. They had been there for 63 years, overlooked by the living world, their families long since gone or scattered. The German military arranged for proper burial with full honors. The ceremony was small, attended by government officials and a few historians, but it received significant media coverage. The story of 8 German paratroopers found in a cave decades after their deaths resonated with the public, symbolizing the human cost of war and the men who disappeared into battles that history forgot. The personal artifacts recovered from the cave were more moving than the remains themselves. Letters written to families, never sent, describing the cold and fear and hope that rescue would come. A diary kept by one of the men, chronicling the group's experiences from the jump through the first weeks of hiding. Photos of wives and children and parents carried across the battlefields of Europe and ultimately into a Belgian cave where the bearers died waiting for a war to end. These items were eventually donated to German military museums, where they were displayed alongside information about Operation Stösser. Museum visitors, most of whom had never heard of the operation, learned about the mission through these artifacts, understanding the human dimensions of military failure through the possessions of men who had lived it. The display was effective precisely because it was personal, transforming statistics into individuals, turning a failed operation into a story about specific men who had jumped into darkness and never returned. The archaeological discoveries also resolved some lingering questions about casualties. The official German records had listed roughly 400 men as missing, their fates unknown. The post-war accounting had confirmed 157 deaths, leaving a gap of nearly 250 men whose fates were uncertain. Had they been captured and died in prisoner camps without proper documentation? Had they died in the Ardennes and been buried as unknown soldiers? Had some survived and chosen not to return to Germany after the war? The archaeological evidence suggested that many of the missing had simply died in the forest, alone or in small groups, and had never been found. Their remains were still out there, scattered across Belgium, slowly returning to the earth. The discoveries clarified that Operation Stösser's death toll was likely much higher than official records indicated, that the operation had killed not 157, but probably 250 to 300 men, that the failure had been even more catastrophic than documented. Present day, the hiking trails of Haute-Vienne. Modern tourists walking the marked trails through the Haute-Vienne region pass small markers indicating sites related to the Battle of the Bulge. Some markers mention Operation Stösser specifically, brief historical notes explaining that German paratroopers had jumped here in December 1944, that the operation had failed, that men had died in these forests. Most hikers passed the markers without much thought, focused on the natural beauty of the region, the peaceful forests and moorlands that show no obvious scars from the war. But occasionally, hikers stop to read the markers carefully, intrigued by the story of the ghost drop, curious about an operation they have never heard of. They stand in forests where paratroopers landed 75 years earlier, trying to imagine what that December night was like, what it meant to jump into darkness and land alone, to be lost and cold and hunted in terrain that is now a pleasant hiking destination. The markers serve a purpose beyond historical education. They are reminders that these peaceful forests were once places of suffering and death, that the ground visitors walk across was a battlefield where men died for reasons that even their commanders could not adequately explain. The markers ask subtle questions. What is worth dying for? What responsibilities do leaders owe the soldiers they command? When does determination become delusion? These questions have no simple answers, but they need to be asked. The ghosts of Operation Stösser, the men who died in these forests, the survivors who carried trauma for decades, the commanders who made impossible choices, demand that the questions continue to be asked, that each generation wrestles with the ethics of command and the limits of obedience and the human cost of strategic miscalculation. The last surviving member of Operation Stösser, whose name the family requested remain private, died in 2012 at age 91. His obituary mentioned his paratrooper service, but did not specifically identify him as a Stösser veteran. With his death, Operation Stösser passed from living memory into pure history, from testimony into archives, from experience into interpretation. The survivors' voices, which had provided direct witness to what happened and what it meant, fell silent. What remained were documents, artifacts, archaeological evidence, and the memories that survivors had shared before dying. These remnants formed an incomplete picture, fragments from which historians would continue trying to reconstruct the whole truth. But some truths about Operation Stösser would remain forever inaccessible, locked in the memories of men who carried them to their graves, lost with the paratroopers who disappeared into the Ardennes and were never found. The ghosts of Heydte persist not as literal hauntings, but as historical presence, as stories that refuse to be forgotten despite the passage of time and the death of witnesses. They persist in the memorials at Baraque, Michel, and Ardennes, in the Bundeswehr ethics courses, in the museum displays of personal artifacts, in the hiking trail markers that note where men once died. They persist in the questions Operation Stösser continues to ask about command responsibility, about institutional failure, about the distance between orders and outcomes, about what soldiers deserve from the leaders who send them into battle. These are not comfortable questions. They challenge assumptions about military discipline and the necessity of following orders. They suggest that sometimes the most honorable action is disobedience, that sometimes saving lives requires refusing missions, that courage in commanders means acknowledging limitations rather than pushing past them. The ghosts ask these questions not to condemn individuals but to expose systems, not to assign personal blame but to reveal institutional failures, not to prosecute the past but to inform the future. And the ghosts ask to be remembered not as heroes who died gloriously or villains who failed shamefully, but as men who were sent on an impossible mission by a military system that valued appearances over outcomes, who did their best under catastrophic circumstances, who survived or died based more on chance than merit, whose experience should teach the living that some operations should never be launched, that strategic necessity does not justify operational impossibility, that the greatest honor we can give the dead is ensuring their mistakes are not repeated. The ghosts of Heydte haunt the forest still, not because they cannot rest, but because the living have not fully learned the lessons their deaths should teach. Until those lessons are learned and applied, until military institutions genuinely integrate the truth that Operation Stösser revealed, that command responsibility includes refusing impossible orders, the ghosts will persist, asking their questions, demanding their answers, insisting that history remember not just what happened, but what it meant and what it should prevent. September 19th, 44. Arnhem, Netherlands. 2 months before Operation Stösser, British paratroopers dropped into Dutch farmland as part of Operation Market Garden, the massive Allied airborne assault designed to seize bridges and open a corridor into Germany. The operation was bold, ambitious, and based on optimistic intelligence assessments that underestimated German strength and overestimated the speed of ground force relief. Within days, British paratroopers at Arnhem found themselves surrounded, cut off, fighting desperately against unexpectedly strong German resistance. The ground forces that were supposed to relieve them were delayed by terrain and opposition. The operation, which Field Marshal Montgomery had promised would end the war by Christmas, collapsed into disaster. Of the 10,000 British paratroopers who jumped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Operation Market Garden failed for reasons that would become familiar 3 months later during Operation Stösser: inadequate intelligence, unrealistic timelines, over-optimistic assumptions, insufficient planning for contingencies. The parallels between Market Garden and Stösser are striking and troubling. Both operations committed airborne forces to objectives beyond their capability. Both assumed ground forces would arrive quickly to provide relief, assumptions that proved wrong. Both ignored warning signs that the operations were risky to the point of recklessness. Both were launched because senior commanders wanted to believe they could succeed, because admitting they were too difficult would have required admitting strategic limitations that institutions were unwilling to acknowledge. Market Garden received infinitely more attention than Stösser because it was an Allied operation and because it involved forces that actually assembled and fought for days before being destroyed. But the fundamental failure was similar. Military organizations launching operations that professional assessment suggested would fail, proceeding on hope and determination rather than realistic capability analysis, sacrificing soldiers to strategic fantasies. The fact that Market Garden preceded Stösser by less than 3 months raises uncomfortable questions. German intelligence knew about Market Garden's failure. German commanders had participated in defeating it. Von der Heydte himself had knowledge of Market Garden's problems. He had studied Allied airborne operations extensively. Yet German High Command launched Operation Stösser anyway, replicating many of Market Garden's mistakes: optimistic timelines, inadequate preparation, assumptions that determination would overcome difficult circumstances. The lesson of Market Garden, that even well-equipped Allied forces with air superiority struggled with complex airborne operations, was available, recent, and ignored. German commanders saw Allied paratroopers fail and decided they could succeed with fewer resources, less preparation, and worse conditions. It was strategic insanity, driven by institutional desperation, and it killed hundreds of men unnecessarily. 1968, Vietnam. American military officers planning special operations in Southeast Asia referenced historical airborne operations, studying successes and failures to inform contemporary planning. Operation Stösser appeared in some planning documents as an example of what not to do: launching operations without adequate intelligence, without realistic timelines, without proper support infrastructure. But the lessons were applied inconsistently, if at all. American forces in Vietnam repeatedly launched operations into hostile territory based on optimistic assumptions about enemy strength and terrain difficulty. Helicopters replaced parachutes, but the fundamental pattern persisted. Commanders wanting operations to succeed badly enough to overlook evidence suggesting they would fail. Institutional pressure to demonstrate aggressive action overriding professional caution. Soldiers paying the price for command optimism. One particular memo from 1968, written by an Army Special Operations officer, explicitly referenced Operation Stösser. The officer was questioning a proposed mission that required inserting a small team deep into Laos to conduct reconnaissance. The memo noted that the insertion site was poorly understood, the terrain was hostile, The extraction plan depended on helicopters reaching the team through defended airspace, and no contingency existed if things went wrong. The memo compared the proposal to Operation Stösser, noting that the German operation had failed for similar reasons: inadequate intelligence, optimistic extraction assumptions, no backup plans. The officer recommended rejecting the mission or substantially revising it. The memo was overruled. The mission launched as originally planned. The team was inserted, ran into unexpected opposition, called for extraction that could not reach them, and was eventually overrun. 4 men died, 3 were captured, 2 escaped after weeks of evasion. The operation accomplished nothing. It was Stösser repeated in different terrain with different technology, but identical command failures. 2001. Afghanistan. American and Allied forces began operations in Afghanistan, including airborne and special operations missions in mountainous terrain with minimal intelligence about enemy positions. Some operations were brilliantly successful, leveraging technology and training to overcome difficult conditions. Others failed or nearly failed because planners underestimated terrain difficulties, enemy capabilities, or logistical constraints. In after-action reviews of failed missions, analysts occasionally noted parallels to historical failures, including Operation Stösser. The pattern was recognizable. Missions launched on tight timelines, commanders pushing for aggressive action despite incomplete information, institutional pressure to demonstrate progress overriding tactical caution. Technology had improved dramatically since 1944: satellite intelligence, precision weapons, advanced communications. But technology could not solve the fundamental problem that had doomed Stösser. Institutional cultures that rewarded optimism over realism, that punished acknowledging limitations, that treated soldiers as resources to be expended rather than lives to be preserved. One former special operations officer, interviewed for a military history project in 2019, spoke about the persistent relevance of Operation Stösser. He had studied the operation during officer training, had written a paper about von der Heydte's decision to dissolve his command. Years later, serving in Afghanistan, he found himself in command of a mission he believed was poorly planned and likely to fail. He protested through channels, documenting his concerns in writing, echoing von der Heydte's approach. Unlike von der Heydte, his protests were taken seriously, the mission was revised, and it ultimately succeeded with 0 casualties. The officer credited studying Stösser with giving him the framework to articulate his concerns and the moral courage to push back against bad planning, but he also noted that his experience was exceptional. Most officers who questioned missions were overruled or sidelined. The institutional bias remained toward action over caution, toward optimism over realistic assessment, toward launching operations and hoping for success rather than pausing to ensure success was actually achievable. The pattern repeats because institutions learn lessons slowly and forget them quickly. After World War II, militaries studied airborne operations extensively, developed doctrine, identified best practices. The lessons included adequate preparation time, realistic objectives, proper intelligence, contingency planning, honest assessment of capabilities versus requirements. These were exactly the lessons Operation Stösser should have taught. Yet decades later, operations still launched without adequate preparation, still proceeded on unrealistic timelines, still assumed capabilities that did not exist. Why? Because the institutional incentives rewarded launching operations, not refusing them. Commanders who pushed back against bad plans were seen as unimaginative or timid. Commanders who launched operations that failed could blame circumstances or subordinates. But commanders who refused operations, who said this cannot be done with available resources, were seen as defeatist, and their careers suffered accordingly. This institutional dynamic ensures that operations like Stösser recur. The specific circumstances change. Different wars, different technologies, different tactical situations. But the underlying pattern persists. Pressure to act decisively, optimism about outcomes, reluctance to acknowledge limitations, soldiers paying for command mistakes. Von der Heydte's written protests before Operation Stösser were remarkable precisely because they were unusual. Most commanders in most eras do not document their objections in writing, do not fight as hard against bad plans, do not risk their careers by insisting that missions are impossible. They execute the orders they receive, hope for the best, and blame circumstances when things go wrong. This is rational behavior for individuals operating in institutional systems that punish dissent more than they punish failure, but it produces predictable disasters, operations that fail for reasons that should have been obvious before they launched, soldiers who die unnecessarily because commanders lack the courage to say no. 2019. German Military Academy Seminar. Modern Bundeswehr officers participate in a war game based on Operation Stösser. They are divided into groups and given the same information von der Heydte had in December 1944. The mission parameters, the resource constraints, the timeline pressures. Each group must decide whether to execute the operation as ordered, request modifications, or refuse outright. The seminar is designed to explore ethical boundaries and command responsibility in scenarios where orders conflict with professional judgment. The results are telling. Every group chooses some form of disobedience or modification. Not a single group of modern German officers, given the same situation von der Heydte faced, chooses to execute the operation as planned. They understand instinctively that the mission is impossible, that launching it would waste lives for no purpose, that command responsibility includes refusing orders when orders are criminally negligent. The seminar instructors point out the disconnect between the war game results and historical reality. Von der Heydte protested but ultimately executed the operation. The modern officers, working in a different institutional culture with different expectations about command authority, feel comfortable refusing or modifying orders their historical counterpart felt compelled to follow. This raises questions about institutional evolution and cultural change. Has the Bundeswehr successfully created a military culture where professional judgment outweighs blind obedience? Or would modern officers, facing actual career consequences and institutional pressure, make the same choices von der Heydte made? The war game cannot answer these questions definitively, but it forces participants to confront them, to recognize that the distance between theoretical ethics and practical choices can be vast, that understanding what you should do is easier than actually doing it when the consequences are real. The seminar also explores what Operation Stösser reveals about modern military challenges. Despite technological advances, despite improved planning processes, despite professional military education emphasizing realistic assessment, the fundamental tensions that created Stösser persist. Political leaders still pressure military commanders to deliver results regardless of resource constraints. Institutional cultures still reward aggressive action over cautious analysis. Commanders still face career pressures that incentivize optimism and punish acknowledging limitations. The tools have changed, but the human and institutional dynamics remain remarkably similar. A modern operation might not fail as spectacularly as Stösser. Better technology provides more margin for error, but the underlying vulnerabilities persist. Operations launched on hope rather than capability, commanders prioritizing institutional expectations over tactical reality, soldiers bearing the consequences of decisions made by people insulated from those consequences. The lesson they didn't learn, the lesson they keep not learning, is simple but painful. Strategic necessity does not create operational capability. Wanting an operation to succeed, needing it to succeed, even desperately requiring it to succeed, does not make it achievable. Capabilities are real and measurable. They depend on training, equipment, intelligence, logistics, coordination, time. Pretending capabilities exist when they do not get soldiers killed. This lesson is simple. It is obvious. It should not need to be repeated. Yet it does need repeating. Generation after generation, war after war, because institutions consistently prioritize wishful thinking over honest assessment. The lesson of Operation Stösser is that 1,200 men jumped into darkness with inadequate preparation, scattered across impossible terrain, and failed completely because commanders wanted to believe determination could overcome impossibility. That lesson should have prevented similar operations in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and wherever future conflicts arise. But it did not and likely will not, because the institutional dynamics that created Stösser remain fundamentally unchanged. Von der Heydte's vindication has been slow but comprehensive. Historical consensus now credits him with making the morally correct decision to dissolve his command, with trying harder than most commanders would have to prevent the operation before it launched, with prioritizing his men's lives over his career advancement. But vindication decades later does not help the men who died in December 1944. They needed the lesson to be learned before they jumped, needed commanders to refuse impossible orders before soldiers paid for them. The vindication is hollow because it came too late, because it changed nothing for the men who mattered. Future generations of historians praising von der Heydte's moral courage is cold comfort to Werner Schultz freezing to death in the Ardennes, to Anton Schreiber hanging from his parachute in a tree, to the 12 men who died in a cave waiting for rescue that never came. They needed the lesson learned in real time, not decades later in academic seminars. The final casualty list for Operation Stösser remains uncertain. Official German records list 157 confirmed deaths. Archaeological discoveries suggest the number was higher, perhaps 250 or more. Many men listed as missing were almost certainly killed, but never identified. Some captured paratroopers died in prisoner camps from wounds or illness, casualties of the operation even if they survived the initial combat phase. The full human cost, including survivors who carried physical and psychological wounds for decades, families destroyed by deaths or prolonged absences, careers and lives altered by injuries sustained during the operation, is incalculable. The operation consumed lives and damaged survivors, all for an objective that was never reached, a mission that accomplished nothing except demonstrating what happens when institutional fantasy overwhelms operational reality. Walking the hiking trails of Hohes Vind today, tourists pass through forests that show no obvious evidence of Operation Stösser. The trees have grown back, the equipment has rusted away, or been recovered. The blood has washed into the soil. Nature has reclaimed the battlefield, erasing the physical traces of what happened here. But the historical traces persist, documented in archives, analyzed in military courses, commemorated in memorials. And the questions persist. Why was this operation launched? Why did commanders proceed despite documented objections? Why did hundreds of men die for an objective that was never achievable? These questions have answers: desperation, institutional pressure, strategic delusion, career incentives that rewarded action over judgment. But the answers are not satisfying because they reveal patterns that persist, because they show that the mistakes that killed the paratroopers of Operation Stösser are still being made, still producing unnecessary casualties, still waiting for institutions to genuinely learn lessons they have been taught repeatedly. The ghost drop that began this story, aircraft overhead, no parachutes visible, soldiers wondering if they imagined it, has become literal historical fact. Operation Stösser disappeared so completely that it nearly vanished from history, that participants questioned whether it had really happened, that historians struggled for decades to reconstruct what occurred. It was the operation that almost wasn't, the mission that failed so thoroughly it became invisible. But invisibility is not the same as irrelevance. Operation Stösser matters precisely because it nearly disappeared, because it shows how easily military failures can be buried and forgotten, how quickly institutions move past disasters without learning their lessons, how completely soldiers can be sacrificed without their sacrifice meaning anything. Bringing the operation back into visibility, telling its story comprehensively, ensuring the ghosts are remembered. This is not about glorifying failure or dwelling on past mistakes. It is about insisting that military history include the operations that failed catastrophically, that command ethics include the commanders who tried to prevent disasters, that lessons actually be learned rather than merely documented. The scattered paratroopers of Operation Stösser, dispersed across the Ardennes in December 1944, are still scattered across history and memory. They exist in fragments, names on memorials, artifacts in museums, brief mentions in histories, longer stories in specialist studies, fading memories among the families of survivors. They deserve better. They deserve to be remembered as whole men who lived full lives before being sent on an impossible mission, who jumped despite fears and doubts because their country demanded it, who died or survived based on factors beyond their control, who should teach the living that some operations must be refused, no matter the institutional pressure to execute them. The lesson they should teach is clear. Whether that lesson will ever be fully learned, whether future commanders will have the wisdom and courage to refuse impossible orders, whether institutions will evolve to reward realistic assessment over optimistic determination, these questions remain open. The ghosts of Operation Stösser wait for answers, asking their questions across 8 decades, patient as only the dead can be, insisting that their experience meant something, that their sacrifice teaches something, that the living owe them the effort to ensure their mistakes are not endlessly repeated. That is the lesson. Learn it or continue paying for not learning it. In blood and lives and operations that fail for the same reasons. Operation Stösser failed because institutions wanted success more than they wanted reality, because commanders valued their careers more than their soldiers' lives, because the machinery of war ground forward without pause for wisdom or mercy or honest reckoning with what was actually possible versus what was merely desired.